In the hours before dawn, when starlight still clings to the olive groves and the Aegean whispers against ancient shores, there lived a woman named Chrysanthe whose hands knew the weight of sacred thread, whose feet traced daily the marble pathways leading to the goddess. The world she inhabited has dissolved into dust and memory, yet for these deep night hours, we will resurrect it. Not with the clamor of battles or the grandiosity of heroes, but with the quiet pulse of a single life lived in devotion. Breathe slowly now, letting the weight of your body sink deeper into stillness. Feel yourself becoming permeable to time, to distance, to the great span of centuries that separates your world from hers. The sounds of your modern life fade like echoes in a cave, replaced by the cry of gulls over harbor water, the rhythmic clack of loom weights, the murmur of prayers rising like incense, smoke toward an impossibly blue sky. Let her world unfold behind your closed eyes like a tapestry woven in twilight colors. Each thread a moment, each pattern a prayer spoken in a language older than written words. Chrysanthe first drew breath in a house built around a square of open sky, in a district called Melody, where the western slopes of the Acropolis caught the honey-colored light of late afternoon. Her father Damon shaped clay on his wheel, transforming earth into vessels so beautiful that merchants traveled from distant cities to purchase them. His workshop smelled of wet clay and kiln smoke, that peculiar mineral scent that clung to his clothes and hair and became for Chrysanthe the very smell of home. You are crossing a threshold, moving backward through the spiral of years, arriving at last in Athens during its golden age, when the Parthenon gleamed new and perfect on the Acropolis, when gods walked close to mortals, when the membrane between seen and unseen was thin as spider silk stretched across morning grass. The house held 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys, their voices overlapping like bird calls, their small feet constant percussion on the courtyard stones. Chrysanthe arrived in the middle of this chorus, neither the precious firstborn nor the treasured baby, but something perhaps more valuable, a watchful presence, a child who noticed things others missed. Her mother, Callisto, moved through rooms that opened onto the courtyard, her footsteps soft on packed earth floors, her voice rising and falling in the eternal music of domestic life, instructing children, greeting neighbors, bargaining with vendors who called from the street. The walls of her childhood home were mud brick plastered smooth and painted in shades of ochre that glowed like fire when sunlight struck them. The floors were earth, swept clean each morning until they shone like polished stone. In the room where men gathered, her father's Andrin, pebbles have been pressed into the floor in patterns of black and white, geometric designs that seemed to shift and dance when lamplight flickered across them. She remembered sunlight slanting through the courtyard, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the still air. She remembered the texture of warm bread against her palms, the way olive oil caught the light in her bowl, the sound of her father's voice humming old songs as he worked his wheel in the hours before dawn. The loom stood against the wall like a patient beast, its wooden frame worn smooth by generations of hands. The weights that held the warped threads taut clicked and swayed with each pass of the shuttle, creating a rhythm that became for Chrysanthe the heartbeat of domestic life. But Chrysanthe spent little time in that masculine space, belonging instead to the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters, where her mother and aunts and older cousins wove cloth on upright looms, their hands moving with the fluid certainty of water flowing downhill. As her hands grew skilled, her ears absorbed the endless stream of women's conversation flowing around the loom like water around river stones. She learned which herb would cool a fever, how to tell good grain from bad by its weight and smell, how to store dried figs in clay jars sealed with olive oil so they would remain sweet through winter's darkness. She learned first to spin, holding the distaff awkwardly, pulling fibers from the mass of prepared wool, twisting them as the spindle dropped and whirled below her uncertain hands. Her first threads were lumpy, thick then thin, then thick again, making her mother laugh softly and guide her fingers to find the proper tension, the right amount of twist. Her mother's voice carried these stories like a river carries boats, steady and strong, never faltering. Callisto spoke while her hands moved at the loom, her words keeping time with the shuttle's passage. Warp and weft, story and silence, pattern emerging from chaos. She learned the names of neighbors and their histories, their marriages and feuds, their secrets and their sorrows. She learned the stories of gods and heroes, tales that explained why winter came, why humans must die, why justice matters even when no one watches, why pride inevitably summons its own destruction. Each day began in darkness, the household stirring when the eastern sky showed only the faintest gray, that ambiguous light that belongs neither to night nor morning, but to the threshold between them. Her father rose first, moving quietly so as not to wake the younger children, pulling on his chiton, the simple wool tunic that was every man's daily garment, belting it at the waist with a cord of twisted leather. He descended to his workshop where the wheel waited and the clay rested beneath damp cloths, where orders needed filling and the kiln needed tending. Breakfast was barley bread torn into pieces and softened in watered wine, sometimes with a handful of olives or a wedge of goat cheese, eaten quickly standing or perched on stools in the courtyard as the sky brightened. The bread was dense and dark, made from grain that grew in the rocky soil of Attica, coarse-textured but deeply satisfying, especially when still warm from the oven, releasing steam when broken open. The wine was always diluted, for to drink it pure was barbaric, the habit of Thracians and other foreigners who had never learned civilization. Chrysanthe listened with an intensity that sometimes worried her more practical siblings, storing each tale like grain against famine, sensing even then that these stories contained something essential, some truth about the nature of existence itself that she would need to understand. Soon after, her mother rose and the women's work began. Young as she was, Chrysanthe had her tasks, simple but necessary. She ground grain between stones, pushing the smaller stone back and forth across the larger, feeling the barley crack and crumble, gradually becoming flour that fell fine and pale beside the grinding corn. Even children drank this mixture, as water from the public fountains, while generally clean, sometimes carried illness, and the wine protected tender bellies from disease. She swept the courtyard with bound twigs, pushing dust and debris toward the drain that led to the street. She scattered grain for the chickens that lived in a corner of the courtyard, watching them peck and scratch, listening to their contented murmuring, occasionally breaking into squabbles that sent feathers flying. Her arms ached with emotion, but there was something meditative in the repetition, the steady rhythm, the gradual transformation of whole grain into powder. She carried water from the fountain, balancing the heavy hydria on her head as she had seen older girls do, though at first she needed both hands to steady it, walking with exaggerated care, terrified of spilling. The agora overwhelmed every sense at once. Smells layered upon smells until the air itself seemed thick, almost visible. Fresh bread from the bakery stalls, fish both fresh and salted, their sharp marine tang competing with the earthy smell of vegetables, the tang of leather, the soft woolen lanolin scent of fleeces, the mysterious spice fragrances from eastern lands, human sweat and animal dung and incense smoke all mingling together. On market days, she accompanied her mother to the agora, clutching Callisto's hand or the edge of her peplos, navigating through crowds that seemed impossibly dense, impossibly loud, impossibly rich with sensory abundance. Chrysanthi held tight to her mother's hand, afraid of being swept away in the human current that flowed through the marketplace like a river in flood. She watched Callisto transform from the soft-spoken woman of the household into something sharper, more formidable, examining produce with a critical eye that missed nothing, squeezing melons to test ripeness, smelling herbs to confirm their freshness, negotiating prices with a firmness that often surprised her daughter. Sound crashed from every direction, merchants calling their wares in rhythmic chants, women arguing over prices, men debating philosophy and politics in knots of waving hands and raised voices, the occasional bleat of a goat or low of an ox brought for sacrifice or sale. Sometimes, when money allowed such luxury, they purchased a section of honeycomb, that golden architecture of wax and sweetness that seemed to capture summer itself, the warmth of sun on hillside time, the drowsy buzzing of bees among flowering herbs. When merchants refused to meet her price, Callisto would simply walk away, and more often than not they would call her back, offering a better bargain, knowing that she knew the true value of things. As Chrysanthi grew toward adolescence, her mother taught her the deeper domestic arts, preparing her for the day when she would manage her own household. She learned to cook simple but sustaining meals. Lentil soup thickened with olive oil and flavored with wild herbs, porridge of barley or wheat, fish grilled over coals until the skin crisped, vegetables prepared a dozen different ways, bread in all its forms. Chrysanthi loved honey beyond all other foods, the way it coated her tongue with pure sweetness, the way it seemed like concentrated light, like joy made edible. It was precious, for there was no other sweetener, no sugar or anything like it, making honey both expensive and treasured. They cooked in the courtyard when weather permitted, or in a small room with a simple hearth when rain or cold drove them indoors. There were no temperature controls, no written recipes with precise measurements. Everything was done by judgment, by accumulated knowledge passed from mother to daughter through demonstration and correction. She learned that cooking was more than following steps, that it was intuition and experience, understanding by smell and feel when oil was hot enough, when dough had risen sufficiently, when fish was perfectly cooked through but not yet dry. She also progressed in textile work, moving from simple spinning to the complexities of weaving. At the loom, she discovered that creating cloth was far more intricate than she had imagined watching her mother work. Every choice mattered. Which way to thread for warp and weft, how tightly to pack the threads, how to create patterns through colored threads or varied weaving techniques. Chrysanthi learned to read the heat of coals by holding her hand above them, learned to judge the readiness of bread by tapping its bottom crust, learned to know when beans had simmered long enough by their texture between her teeth. The women worked together at the larger looms, creating wider pieces of cloth, their movements coordinated like dancers following music only they could hear. These were times of bonding, of sharing life itself along with labor. Stories flowed, advice was offered, complaints aired and sympathy given, jokes shared and laughter rising like music through the courtyard. A simple cloth for work tunics required different skills than fine fabric for ceremonial robes. Both demanded patience, attention, acceptance that the work would take as long as it took, that rushing produced only inferior results. When Chrysanthi reached her 12th year, her life changed utterly. Representatives from the temples of Athena came to her father's workshop one spring morning, accompanied by an official from the sacred administration, their presence transforming the ordinary day into something momentous. In a society that separated men and women into distinct spheres, these female spaces became complete worlds, rich with their own culture and wisdom, their own forms of power and knowledge. For Damon, this news brought tremendous pride, confirmation that his family was respected, his household considered pious and proper, his daughter worthy to approach the goddess. For Callisto, emotions tangled together. Pride certainly, but also the natural reluctance of a mother facing separation from her child. Girls in temple service often lived away from home for years, and even when they returned for visits, their primary allegiance belonged to the goddess, not the family. They explained that Chrysanthi had been identified as a candidate to serve as an ergasthenai, one of the girls who would help weave the sacred peplos presented to Athena during the great Panathenaic festival. From among these girls, some might be chosen for even greater honors, perhaps serving as a referoi, living on the Acropolis itself, participating in the most secret and sacred rituals. The selection was not yet final. She would undergo observation and training. Priests and priestesses would assess her temperament and capability, watch for signs of divine favor or disfavor. But it was an enormous step forward, and the family understood that something fundamental had shifted. That evening, Damon sacrificed a chicken, a significant expense, but one the occasion warranted. For Chrysanthi herself, the announcement produced a feeling too large for her young heart to contain, an awe so profound she could barely breathe, barely speak, barely think beyond the overwhelming sense that her life had just revealed its true purpose. In the days that followed, Chrysanthi began climbing the path to the Acropolis, that long winding ascent up the sacred hill. The Acropolis rose abruptly from the plain, a massive limestone outcropping with slopes too steep for easy assault, its summit flattened and built up with retaining walls, crowned with temples and shrines that seemed to float between earth and sky. They roasted it carefully, first offering a portion to Athena by burning it until smoke rose toward the heavens where the gods might inhale its savory essence, then eating the rest with a reverence that silenced even the usually boisterous brothers. The path was paved with smooth stones worn by countless feet, leading to the Propolia, the monumental gateway that controlled access to the sacred precinct. The Propolia was itself magnificent, imposing columns and precise proportions that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and awe-inspiring. The ascent itself was transformative, leaving behind the noise and commerce of the lower city, climbing through a zone of contemplation, arriving at last where the boundary between mortal and divine seemed to dissolve like morning mist in sunlight. Before her stood the Parthenon, the great temple of Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin. Though completed only decades before, it already ranked among the wonders of the Greek world, a building so perfectly proportioned, so harmoniously designed, that seemed to have grown from the bedrock rather than been constructed by human effort. Passing through its shadowed interior and emerging on the other side, Chrysanthi always felt she was entering a different realm entirely, a space governed by different laws, infused with presence she could sense but never quite see. But Chrysanthi's service would center not on the Parthenon, but on the older temple, the Erechtheion, smaller, but in some ways more sacred. The Erechtheion housed the ancient wooden cult statue of Athena, the simple Zoanon that had supposedly fallen from heaven in legendary times, which the Athenians treasured far more than the magnificent gold and ivory statue inside the Parthenon. Its columns were massive cylinders of marble quarried from Mount Pentelicus and hauled to the site with tremendous labor, and they glowed golden in afternoon sunlight. The entire structure seemed luminous, as if lit from within by divine fire, the marble reflecting and amplifying light until the building radiated an almost supernatural brightness. The high priestess who would oversee her training was named Aristono, descended from ancient kings, a woman of perhaps 40 years who carried herself with a dignity that seemed almost goddess-like. Her peplos was fine wool dyed deep saffron yellow, the color reserved for sacred service. Her dark hair was pulled back and secured in an elegant style, crowned with olive leaves sacred to Athena. Service to the goddess was not undertaken lightly. It required dedication, purity of body and spirit, meticulous attention to ritual detail. Every action in the sacred precinct must be performed with proper reverence. Chrysanthi would need to learn prayers and hymns, proper forms of sacrifice, correct procedures for various rituals. This ancient image was dressed in the newly woven peplos during the Panathenaic festival, and weaving this garment would be Chrysanthi's sacred responsibility. When she spoke to Chrysanthi, her voice was kind but serious, explaining the weight of what was being offered. Chrysanthi listened carefully, absorbing every word, feeling no reluctance or resentment, but rather a growing sense of rightness, as if her entire childhood had been preparation for this moment, as if she had been moving toward this threshold since her first breath. She thought of Athena, goddess of wisdom and craft, patron of her city, protector of civilization itself. She would need to maintain herself in ritual purity, observing prohibitions regarding food, abstaining from polluting activities, performing regular purifications with water and fumigations. She would live much of her life in sacred time, her days structured not by personal desire, but by divine requirement. The training began gently with observation. At first, Chrysanthi simply watched the priestesses perform their daily duties, learning that temple service involved far more than the dramatic public rituals she had witnessed during festivals. Most of the work was quiet and repetitive, a constant round of small tasks performed with care and devotion. What greater honor could exist than serving such a deity, dedicating one's life to maintaining the divine favor that allowed Athens to flourish? She learned the geography of the sacred precinct, the location and significance of every shrine and altar. The shrine of Athena Nike, Athena as bringer of victory, on a bastion jutting from the western edge. The altar of Athena Polias in front of the Erechtheion, where the most important sacrifices were performed. Temples and shrines needed cleaning and maintenance. Offerings left by worshippers needed collection and proper disposal or storage. Lamps needed filling with oil and tending to keep them burning. Incense needed preparation and burning at appropriate times. Sacred objects required cleaning, polishing, arranging with precise correctness. Each location had its own stories, its own requirements for proper worship. Chrysanthi learned which offerings belonged at which shrines, which prayers for which occasions, which rituals for which times of day or seasons of year. It was a vast body of knowledge accumulated over centuries, passed down through generations of priestesses. The sacred olive tree sprung from rock when Athena struck it with her spear in her contest with Poseidon for patronage of the city, miraculously regrown after Persian invaders burned the original. The mark of Poseidon's trident in the rock, and the spring of salt water that gushed forth at his touch. Shrines to other deities who shared the sacred hill: Artemis, Zeus, Pandrosos, and others. As seasons turned and Chrysanthi's training progressed, she was gradually permitted to participate more actively in rituals. She learned the proper way to pour libations, tilting the vessel so liquid flowed in a smooth stream onto the altar or into earth. Much was not written, but preserved through oral tradition, learned by watching and doing and remembering, by repetition until knowledge became instinct. She was taught the art of ritual purity, the various purifications required before approaching the sacred. She learned to wash her hands and face in lustral water, special water sanctified for this purpose, kept in vessels called pararanteria that stood near entrances to sacred spaces. She learned that certain activities rendered one temporarily unfit for temple service. Contact with death, childbirth, menstruation, sexual intercourse. Even certain foods were considered polluting and must be avoided by those in active service. She learned the prayers that accompanied these offerings, words repeated for generations, their ancient rhythms polished smooth by countless repetitions. She learned to burn incense on small bronze burners, watching smoke rise and dissipate, carrying mortal prayers to immortal gods. She learned about the sacred calendar that structured the religious year. Athens observed more festivals than perhaps any other Greek city, with barely a month passing without major celebration. The Panathenaea, the great festival honoring Athena that came annually, with a particularly elaborate version every fourth year. The mysteries of Eleusis, though these belonged primarily to Demeter. These prohibitions were not punishments, but recognitions that the sacred and profane must be kept separate, that approaching the divine required a special state of being, set apart from ordinary mortal conditions. Some festivals were solemn and mysterious, others joyful and even wild. Some included secret rites known only to initiates. Others were great public spectacles involving the entire city. The priestesses of Athena participated in many celebrations, not just those directly honoring their goddess, because all gods were honored in Athens, and maintaining good relationships with the entire divine community was essential to the city's prosperity and survival. The Thesmophoria for married women, the Anthisteuria celebrating new wine, the Dionysia honoring Dionysus, the Thargelia for Apollo, and many others. Each had its own rituals, its own requirements, its own significance. By her 14th year, Chrysanthi had officially become one of the Ergastinae, one of the girls charged with weaving the sacred peplos for Athena. This was no simple garment, but a massive textile richly decorated with scenes from mythology, particularly depicting Athena's role in the great battle between gods and giants. Chrysanthi found herself drawn into this rich tapestry of ritual and celebration, marking time not by arbitrary days, but by sacred occasions that gave shape and meaning to the passing year. The work was exacting and sometimes tedious, requiring hours of concentrated attention. Chrysanthi sat at the loom, her fingers moving constantly, passing the shuttle back and forth, beating weft threads into place with a wooden beater, her eyes watching for any irregularity in tension or spacing. The weaving took the better part of a year, work beginning shortly after one Panathenaic festival and continuing until the next. Chrysanthe and the other selected girls worked on a special loom set up near the Acropolis, under supervision of experienced weavers and priestesses who ensured every aspect of the work was performed correctly and with proper reverence. As she worked, Chrysanthe often entered a meditative state, her conscious mind growing quiet while her hands continued their practiced movements. In these moments, she felt closest to Athena, for the goddess was herself a weaver, patron of all textile arts, and the loom was in some sense her sacred instrument. The threads were dyed in brilliant colors, deep blues and reds, bright yellows and rich purples. The purple especially precious as it came from murex shells and was extraordinarily expensive, reserved for only the most important figures in the design. The work was done in companionship with other girls, and here Chrysanthe formed friendships that would last throughout her life. There was Clea, daughter of a general, quick-witted and bold, always ready with a joke that made them laugh despite the solemnity of their surroundings. Chrysanthe imagined that when she wove, she participated in divine creation, bringing order from chaos, creating beauty and meaning from simple threads. The peplos, when completed, would be more than a garment. It would be an offering embodying the skill, devotion, and labor of the entire community, a tangible expression of Athens' relationship with its patron goddess. Together, these girls formed a small community within the larger religious community of the Acropolis. They shared not just work, but their lives, their hopes and fears, their observations about the world around them. They were all from respectable families, though some wealthier than others, some from more distinguished lineages. There was Milena, shy and gentle, whose fingers seemed almost supernaturally skilled at the intricate, detailed work required for figured portions of the weaving. There was Xantha, practical and organized, who kept track of supplies and schedules, ensuring they never ran short of thread or fell behind in their work. During the months of weaving, Chrysanthe lived partly at home and partly in quarters provided near the Acropolis. The routine of her days took on a steady, comforting rhythm. She rose early, performed morning ablutions, ate a simple breakfast, then made her way to the weaving room. But in their service to the goddess, these differences mattered less than they might have in the outside world. They were united by shared purpose and shared privilege of performing this sacred labor. Afternoons might include more weaving or be devoted to other tasks, learning hymns, practicing ritual procedures, studying the myths and stories that explain the images they were weaving into the peplos, or simply performing routine maintenance work that kept temples and shrines clean and properly supplied. Morning light was considered best for detailed work, so the most intricate portions of weaving were always scheduled for these hours. She worked steadily until midday when the sun was high and hot, making the enclosed weaving room uncomfortable and the light too harsh. This was time for a break, for a simple meal of bread and cheese, olives and figs, and for rest. The nights when she stayed on the Acropolis had a special quality that Chrysanthe cherished. After crowds of daytime worshippers had departed, after the city below had quieted for the night, the sacred hill became a place of profound peace. The marble temples glowed pale in moonlight, seeming almost to float above the earth. Night birds called softly from rocks and olive trees. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, There were evening rituals to perform, lamps to light, prayers to say. Then, as darkness fell, Chrysanthi would either return home to her family or remain in the sacred precinct, depending on the specific requirements of that day and season. Chrysanthi would sometimes walk quietly through the precincts, feeling the divine presence more strongly in these nighttime hours than during the bustle of day. She would stand before the Parthenon, its columns creating patterns of light and shadow in the moon's glow, and feel herself infinitesimally small before the grandeur of the goddess and the civilization the goddess protected. She would visit the ancient olive tree, touching its rough bark gently, reverently, thinking of the miracle of its regrowth, of the way Athena's power continually renewed itself and the city. The breeze that nearly always blew across the hilltop carried the scent of the sea, that distinctive salt and life smell that spoke of the element that was Athens' highway to commerce and empire. One of the most important and mysterious aspects of Chrysanthi's service came when she was selected to be one of the Erephoroi, a position she assumed in her 15th year. The Erephoroi were 2 or sometimes 4 young girls, always prepubescent, chosen each year to live on the Acropolis and perform certain special duties. She would look out over Athens spread below, seeing scattered lights of lamps and fires, hearing distant sounds of a city never entirely silent, feeling the weight of her responsibility to help maintain the divine favor that allowed this community to exist and flourish. The duties of the Erephoroi included various tasks in service to Athena, including helping to begin the weaving of the sacred peplos, but their most important responsibility involved a secret ritual performed during the festival called the Euphoria. The exact nature of this ritual was never spoken of publicly, and even now, millennia later, we can only guess at details from fragmentary references. The selection was considered a very great honor, and Chrysanthi's family was overcome with pride and emotion when the news came. As an Erephoroi, she would live on the Acropolis for the better part of a year, in a special house maintained for this purpose, under the high priestess's supervision. Chrysanthi remembered the night of her first Euphoria with vivid clarity for the rest of her life, though she never spoke of it in detail to anyone not initiated into the mystery. She remembered the sensation of being dressed in special robes, white as snow, her head crowned with a garland of flowers. What is known is that the Erephoroi were given sacred objects to carry, objects covered so they could not see what they carried, and they had to descend from the Acropolis by a secret underground passage, emerging in a sacred precinct of Aphrodite in the gardens below, where they deposited their burden and received something else, similarly covered, which they brought back up to the Acropolis. She remembered the feeling of transition, of passing through a liminal space between different states of being, different modes of existence. She remembered emerging into the nighttime garden, moonlight on leaves, the sound of water from a spring sacred to Aphrodite, the presence of priestesses waiting to receive what she carried and to give her the returning burden. She remembered the weight of the covered basket she was given to carry, balanced on her head, her hands forbidden to touch it, forbidden even to know what it contained. She remembered descending into darkness of the underground passage, lit only by a single lamp carried by an attending priestess, the walls close and the air thick with the smell of earth. The meaning of the ritual was never explained directly, but through hints and symbolic explanations, she came to understand that it had something to do with fertility, with the cycle of life and death and renewal, with the relationship between Athena, the virgin warrior, and the forces of generation and sexuality represented by Aphrodite. She remembered the ascent back through the tunnel to the Acropolis, feeling that she carried something immensely important, though she knew not what, feeling that she participated in a mystery connecting the deepest past with the present moment and extending into the unknowable future. Living on the Acropolis as an Erephoroi gave Chrysanthe even deeper immersion in the sacred. She was surrounded constantly by reminders of divine presence. Her small room in the Erephoroi house was simple, furnished only with a bed, a chest for her few possessions, perhaps a chair. The walls were painted with simple frescoes depicting mythological scenes, with the way that even a city as devoted to wisdom and martial prowess as Athens depended ultimately on the fertility of the earth and the renewal of generations. The secrecy itself was part of the power of the ritual, creating a boundary between initiated and uninitiated, reinforcing the sense that the divine world operated according to its own logic, not fully comprehensible to mortal minds. She was separated from her family for much of this period, though they were permitted to visit on certain occasions, and she could sometimes leave the sacred precinct under proper supervision. But her primary community now consisted of the other Erephoroi, the priestesses who supervised them, and the various temple attendants and officials who maintained sacred spaces and conducted rituals. Her days followed a precise schedule. She rose at dawn, before the sun appeared over the eastern horizon, and immediately performed ritual ablutions, washing her hands, face, and feet in cold water that purified her for the day's sacred duties. She dressed carefully in her white robe, arranged her hair simply, placed the garland on her head. Through the window, she could see the Parthenon, could hear the prayers and rituals being performed at various shrines and altars throughout the day and night. It was a small world in many ways, but one dense with meaning and purpose. After prayers came a simple breakfast, eaten in silence or near silence, a practice that reinforced the sense of being set apart from ordinary life. Then came the day's work, which varied depending on the time of year and approaching festivals. There was always the weaving, slowly advancing on the great loom. Then came morning prayers, chanted in unison with the other Erephoroi and the priestesses, ancient words and rhythms that seemed to connect directly to something fundamental in the human spirit. Midday brought a break from labor, time for a meal and for rest during the hottest hours when the sun beat down mercilessly on white marble and made physical work uncomfortable. Chrysanthe often spent this time in study or quiet contemplation. There were preparations for rituals, ensuring that all necessary supplies were ready, that altars were clean, that offerings were properly arranged. There was time for instruction, learning more of the vast body of traditional knowledge that a priestess must master. Or she might simply sit in a shaded spot, perhaps under the ancient olive tree, and let her mind wander through the myths and stories that formed the foundation of her religious understanding. She thought about Athena, born fully formed from Zeus's head, armed and ready for battle from her first moment of existence. She might read, for she had been taught to read, a skill not universal among women, but considered appropriate for priestesses who needed to understand written prayers and inscriptions. She might practice on the lyre, for music was an important part of religious ritual, and priestesses were expected to be skilled in singing and instrumental performance. She thought about Athena's role as protector of cities, as patron of heroes, as goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, distinct from Ares's more brutal and chaotic approach to battle. She thought about the goddess's gifts to humanity, the olive tree that provided oil for food, light, and trade, the art of weaving that transformed raw wool or flax into useful and beautiful cloth, the skills of bronze working and pottery that advanced civilization. These stories were not just entertainment or education. They were templates for understanding how the world worked, how gods and mortals related to each other, what constituted proper behavior, and what brought disaster. The myths taught that the gods demanded respect and appropriate honor. The hubris, excessive pride that led one to challenge or slight the divine, always met with punishment. She thought about stories of Athena's interactions with mortals, her mentoring of heroes like Odysseus and Perseus, her contest with other gods like her competition with Poseidon for Athens' patronage, her punishments of those who offended her like Arachne, who dared claim to be a better weaver than the goddess herself. Chrysanthe internalized these values deeply during her time as an Erephoroi. She came to see her own life not as an individual story, but as part of a larger pattern, one thread in a vast weaving that extended back to the beginning of time and forward into an unknown future. They taught that humans should cultivate excellence in whatever their sphere might be, that they should seek sophrosyne, moderation, and self-control, that they should honor their families, their communities, and their gods. The afternoon brought a return to activity. There might be more weaving or time devoted to preparing for specific rituals. As various festivals approached, preparations intensified. The small and relatively simple daily offerings gave way to elaborate arrangements for major celebrations that might involve the entire city. Animals for sacrifice had to be selected, purchased, brought to the Acropolis, and kept in readiness. These animals, whether cattle, sheep, goats, or pigs, had to be perfect, without blemish or defect, worthy to be offered to the gods. Her individual desires and preferences mattered less than fulfilling her role properly. Serving the goddess with the excellence and devotion that the goddess deserved, maintaining the rituals that maintained the cosmic order itself. Chrysanthe learned the proper procedures for sacrifice, though, as a woman, she would not herself perform the killing. That was the prerogative of male priests or officials. But she learned the prayers that accompanied each stage of the ritual, the scattering of barley grains, the cutting of hair from the animal's head, the pouring of wine, the invocation of the deity. They were treated with care, even reverence, for they would become mediators between mortal and divine, their blood sanctifying the altars, their smoke carrying prayers to Olympus, their meat becoming sacred food shared in communal feasting. She learned that sacrifice was the fundamental act of Greek religion, the primary way that mortals communicated with and honored the gods. Through sacrifice, humans acknowledged their dependence on divine power, shared food with the gods, creating a bond of reciprocity and mutual obligation. She learned to read signs of divine acceptance or rejection. Did the animal come willingly to the altar, or did it resist? Did the fire consume the offerings readily, or did it smoke and smolder? Did the entrails, when examined, show the proper configuration that indicated divine favor? The great festivals were times of intense activity, but also of joy and communal celebration. During the Panathenea, the city came together in a massive demonstration of civic unity and religious devotion. The festival lasted several days and included athletic contests, musical competitions, dramatic performances, processions, and of course sacrifices. The climax came when the newly woven peplos was carried through the city in a great procession, mounted on a cart rigged like a ship, pulled by citizens representing all segments of Athenian society, magistrates and generals, priests and priestesses, young warriors and maidens, elders and children, medics, the foreign residents who lived in Athens. Chrysanthe, as one of those who had woven the peplos, walked in a position of honor in the procession, feeling the eyes of thousands upon her, hearing the singing and music, the prayers and acclamations. The route wound through the agora, past the various shops and buildings, then up the Panathenaic Way to the Acropolis. The gods received the portions due them, the savory smoke rising to Olympus, while humans consumed the meat, transformed by the ritual from ordinary food in a sacred substance that connected them to the divine, all joining together in this affirmation of collective identity and shared devotion. At the Acropolis, the peplos was received with great ceremony and used to dress the ancient wooden statue of Athena Polias in the Erechtheion. Then came the great hecatomb, the sacrifice of 100 cattle, an enormous offering that demonstrated Athens' wealth and piety. The scent of roasting meat filled the air. The smoke rose in great columns. For Chrysanthe, these festivals were moments of profound meaning. She felt part of something far larger than herself, connected to every other Athenian, to the ancestors who had performed these same rituals for generations, to future Athenians, yet unborn, who would continue the traditions. The crowds lined the route, throwing flowers, calling out prayers to Athena, celebrating their city and its divine protector. And afterwards, the meat was distributed and consumed in a massive feast, with portions given to all citizens and residents, so that the entire city participated in the sacred meal, sharing in the blessings that the goddess bestowed. But between the great festivals were long stretches of ordinary time, and it was in these quieter periods that Chrysanthe perhaps grew most in understanding and in her relationship with the divine. The daily round of small rituals, performed faithfully even when no crowds watched, even when there was no external recognition, taught her about the nature of true devotion. She felt the presence of Athena herself, the goddess blessing her city and people, maintaining the special relationship that made Athens great. She learned patience as she sat at the loom, day after day, watching the fabric grow with agonizing slowness, knowing that there were no shortcuts, that the work would take as long as it took, that trying to rush would only compromise the quality and dishonor the goddess. She learned that piety was not about dramatic gestures or grand emotions, but about quiet consistency, about showing up each day to perform the necessary tasks with care and attention, about maintaining the sacred spaces and relationships even when it was tedious or difficult. As her year as an Erephoroi drew toward its close, Chrysanthe felt a mixture of emotions. She had grown deeply attached to this life, to the intensity and focus of living constantly in sacred time and space. She had formed close bonds with the other girls serving alongside her, relationships forged in shared purpose and shared mystery. She learned humility as she cleaned and swept, performed tasks that might seem menial, but were essential to maintaining proper respect for sacred space. She learned that the divine was present not just in the dramatic moments of sacrifice and festival, but in the quiet, repetitive rhythms of daily devotion. But she also knew that this particular phase of her service was temporary by its nature. The Erephoroi were always young girls who had not yet reached puberty. Once a girl experienced her first menstruation, she could no longer serve in this capacity. The transition from child to woman brought both capabilities and limitations in religious terms. She had experienced moments of what she could only understand as direct contact with the divine, times when the presence of Athena seemed almost tangibly real, when prayer became not just words but genuine communication, when ritual felt like stepping outside ordinary time into a space where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. When Chrysanthe's time as an Erephoroi ended, it was with a special ceremony that marked her transition. She dedicated her childhood things to Athena, including her toys and the special robe she had worn in her service. This was a common practice, a way of acknowledging that a phase of life had ended and a new one was beginning. A mature woman could serve as a priestess in various capacities, some of great importance and prestige, but certain roles were reserved specifically for children, for those whose bodies had not yet awakened to the adult rhythms of fertility and sexuality. The return to family life required its own adjustments. Chrysanthe had changed during her time as an Erephoroi, had become more serious, more inward, more focused on the spiritual dimensions of existence. Her siblings seemed both familiar and strange, their concerns about daily matters feeling somewhat trivial to one who had been living in constant contact with the eternal. She offered prayers of gratitude for the privilege she had been given, for the protection and guidance she had received. And then she left the Acropolis house where she had lived and returned to her family home, though she knew that her connection to temple service was far from over. Chrysanthe was now of marriageable age, and in the normal course of events, her father would have begun negotiating a marriage for her, seeking a suitable husband from among appropriate families. But for a girl who had served as an Erephoroi, who had participated in sacred mysteries, the path forward was not quite so straightforward. Her mother recognized the change in her daughter and felt a mixture of pride and a slight sadness, understanding that Chrysanthe's closest attachments would always be to the goddess and the religious community rather than to family in the ordinary way. There was also the possibility that Chrysanthe might continue in temple service on a more permanent basis. Priestesses could marry, or they could remain unmarried. Different cults had different requirements. Some priesthoods were filled for life, others for fixed terms. Some require virginity, others did not. Some families considered such girls especially desirable as brides, believing that the divine favor that had led to their selection would continue to bless their households. Other families were more hesitant, worried that a girl who had experienced such intense religious service might find it difficult to adjust to the ordinary duties of a wife and mother. Chrysanthe herself felt torn. Part of her longed to continue in sacred service, to dedicate her entire life to the goddess who had become the center of her existence. But another part, a part perhaps more tied to social expectations and to what was considered normal and proper, thought about marriage and children, about having a household of her own, about fulfilling the role that society expected of women. The priesthood of Athena Polias itself was a position of enormous prestige, held for life by a woman from one of the ancient families descended from the early kings of Athens. But there were many other positions in the service of Athena and other deities, roles that carried honor and responsibility, if perhaps not the supreme authority of the high priestess. The decision was made, in the end, through signs and consultations. Aristono, the high priestess who had guided so much of Chrysanthe's training, advised that she seek guidance from the goddess herself. Chrysanthe spent a night in prayer at the temple, asking Athena to make her well known. She thought about her mother, about the satisfaction Callisto clearly took in her family, in nurturing and guiding her children, in the intimate knowledge of managing a household. That path had its own validity and meaning, its own connection to the divine, for the household was itself a sacred space, with altars to household gods, with rituals that connected family to the larger cosmic order. What she experienced that night was not a dramatic vision or a voice speaking from the air, but rather a deep sense of peace and clarity when she thought about continuing in temple service. She offered sacrifice and watched the signs, looking for divine communication in the behavior of the flames, in dreams that might come, in the intuitions that arose in deep meditation. When she communicated this to Aristono, the high priestess nodded with satisfaction, as if she had expected this outcome. She explained that Chrysanthe could dedicate herself formally as a lifelong servant of the goddess, taking vows that would bind her to specific obligations and restrictions, but would also grant her status and authority within the religious hierarchy. She felt that this was her path, that her life would find its deepest meaning in dedicated service to Athena, that she was being called to forego the ordinary pleasures and responsibilities of marriage and motherhood in favor of a different kind of relationship and a different kind of fruitfulness. Chrysanthe's father, when informed of this decision, felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was pride, certainly tremendous pride that his daughter would hold such an honored position. There was also the practical consideration that he would not need to provide a dowry, no small matter for a family of moderate means. But there was also some regret, for he would not have grandchildren from his daughter, would not see her established in her own household in the normal way. He wondered if he was somehow responsible, if he should have discouraged her religious intensity when she was younger, guided her toward more ordinary aspirations. She would continue to participate in the weaving of the peplos each year. She would train younger girls as she had been trained. She would participate in all the rituals and festivals. She would become a guardian of tradition, a living link in the chain that stretched back to the beginnings of Athenian civilization. Callisto wept when she learned the news, though whether from joy or sorrow, even she could not entirely say. She had always known that Chrysanthe was special, had always recognized something set apart in her daughter's character. She was losing her daughter in one sense, but she was also seeing her elevated to a position of honor and importance that reflected well on the entire family. But he also recognized that this had always been Chrysanthe's nature, that she had always been drawn to the sacred, and he could not help but feel that there was something right about this outcome, something fated about it. The formal dedication ceremony took place during the following Panathenaic festival. Chrysanthe, dressed in a new white peplos specially made for the occasion, stood before the altar of Athena Polias, with Aristono presiding and the other priestesses gathered around. She spoke the ancient vows, dedicating her life to the goddess's service, promising to maintain ritual purity, to perform her duties with devotion and excellence, to uphold the traditions that have been passed down through countless generations. And Chrysanthe would not disappear entirely from her life. She would still visit, would still be present for family occasions, just with her primary allegiance always to the goddess rather than to family. As she spoke the vows, Chrysanthe felt a tremendous sense of rightness, of coming home to the place where she truly belonged. She felt the goddess's acceptance, not through any miraculous sign, but through the deep peace that filled her spirit. She offered sacrifice, a young goat whose blood sanctified her dedication, as she presented gifts to the goddess, a beautifully woven textile that represented months of her work, and a small bronze mirror, symbolic of clarity and self-knowledge. In the years that followed, Chrysanthi grew into her role as a priestess of Athena. She became one of the reliable presences at the temple, one of those to whom others turned for guidance and assistance. She trained each year's new group of young girls chosen to weave the peplos, passing on the skills and knowledge that had been given to her. She knew that her life would not be easy, that there would be sacrifices and challenges, that she was giving up things that others considered essential to happiness. But she also knew that she was choosing a path of meaning and purpose, that her life would matter in ways that transcended personal satisfaction. Through all of this, the rhythms of religious life provided continuity and stability. The festivals came each year at their appointed times, connecting each present moment to all the past celebrations of the same occasions. The daily rituals continued, an anchor in turbulent times. She performed countless rituals, her prayers and offerings maintaining the proper relationship between Athens and its patron goddess. She witnessed history unfold around her, living through the tensions that led to war between Athens and Sparta, seeing the city's fortunes rise and fall, experiencing both the glories and the tragedies of the late 5th century. Chrysanthi's days settled into a pattern that varied with the seasons and the sacred calendar, but maintained a fundamental consistency. She rose each morning before dawn, that liminal time between night and day that seemed especially suitable for approaching the divine. She performed her ablutions, the cold water shocking her into wakefulness and purity. The presence of the goddess, channeled through her priestesses and sanctuaries, reassured the Athenian people that they were not alone, that they were watched over by divine power, that their city had cosmic significance. She dressed in the yellow-dyed peplos that marked her status as a priestess, arranged her hair, placed the olive crown on her head. After prayers came a simple breakfast, then the day's work began. Some days focused on maintenance and preparation, cleaning the temples, filling lamps with oil, ensuring that supplies of barley, wine, and incense were adequate for upcoming rituals. Other days were devoted to weaving, whether the great peplos or other textiles needed for various religious purposes. Morning prayers came first, usually performed with several other priestesses, their voices joining in ancient hymns that have been sung for generations. There is something profoundly moving about this daily act of collective prayer, the way individual voices blended into a unified offering, the way the familiar words created a meditative space that prepared them for the day's activities. The work of a priestess was physically demanding in ways that might surprise those who imagine religious service as purely contemplative. Chrysanthi spent hours standing during long rituals, walking up and down the slopes of the Acropolis multiple times each day, carrying vessels of water or oil, moving cult objects that could be quite heavy. Still other days were dominated by rituals themselves, sacrifices and offerings, prayers and ceremonies that required careful performance according to precise traditional forms. But there was also contemplative depth to her life, periods of quiet meditation, times when she sat before the ancient statue of Athena and opened her mind and heart to the goddess's presence and guidance. In these moments, Chrysanthi sometimes felt that she touched something vast and eternal, something that existed beyond words and concepts. Her hands grew strong from work at the loom, from grinding grain for sacred cakes, from all the physical labor that maintaining a temple required. Her voice grew strong from constant singing and prayer, able to project hymns so that worshipers gathered in the precinct could hear and join in. She came to understand that being a priestess meant being a mediator between different realms. She stood between the gods and the people, interpreting divine will, channeling divine blessing, helping ordinary people access the sacred. She stood between past and future, preserving ancient traditions and passing them forward to new generations. It was not that the goddess spoke to her in any literal sense, but rather that in the silence and stillness, insights arose, understanding deepened, and she felt held in something larger than herself, something that gave meaning and purpose to all her efforts. This role brought both satisfaction and burden. It was deeply meaningful to be trusted with such important responsibilities, to know that the proper functioning of the city's relationship with its divine patron depended in part on her faithful service. But it was also isolating in some ways. She stood between the ideal and the real, holding up the values and principles that should govern life, even as she acknowledged human imperfection and failure. Her relationships with other priestesses became her primary human connections. These women were the ones who truly understood her life, who shared her commitments and concerns. Among them, she found deep friendship, the kind that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. There was Nicandre, a few years older than Chrysanthi, who had an earthy sense of humor that could make them laugh even during the most solemn preparations. There was Eucaline, brilliant and thoughtful, who loved to discuss philosophy and theology, exploring the deeper meanings of myths and rituals. Together, these women formed a community that sustained and supported each other. They worked side by side at the loom, their hands moving in practice coordination. They shared meals, simple but satisfying, eating together in companionable conversation or comfortable silence. She could not fully participate in ordinary life, could not let herself be caught up in the petty dramas and concerns that occupied most people. She had to maintain a certain distance, a certain separation, embodying in her person the boundary between sacred and profane. There was Theano, practical and organized, who managed the complex logistics of major festivals with impressive efficiency. They also dealt together with the more difficult aspects of temple service. There were political pressures, as various factions within Athens sought to influence religious matters for their own advantage. There were financial challenges, as temple funds had to be carefully managed to ensure that all necessary expenses could be met. They supported each other through illness and loss, through the deaths of family members, through the anxieties that came from living in uncertain times. They celebrated together when things went well, when a ritual was perfectly performed, when a festival concluded successfully, when signs of divine favor were clear and unmistakable. Chrysanthi witnessed the strains that were placed on religious life. As the Peloponnesian War dragged on, year after year, resources became more constrained. Families that might have funded elaborate sacrifices had less wealth to spare. There were disputes over interpretations of tradition, debates about how to handle situations for which there was no clear precedent. Through all of this, the priestesses had to navigate carefully, maintaining the integrity and independence of sacred service while acknowledging the realities of existing within a complex political and social system. But through all of this, the religious calendar continued. The festivals still came at their appointed times. The rituals were still performed. In some ways, they became even more important, a source of continuity and meaning when so much else seemed uncertain or lost. Young men who should have been celebrating festivals were away fighting or worse, dead on distant battlefields, or from the plague that struck Athens in the early years of the war. The confidence and optimism that had characterized Athens during its golden age gave way to anxiety and occasionally despair. Chrysanthe saw people turn to religion with new intensity during these difficult years, seeking reassurance, seeking explanation for suffering, seeking to influence divine will through offerings and prayers. The temples were crowded with suppliants, people desperate for help, for healing, for protection, for victory. The priestesses worked to maintain proper observance, understanding that their faithfulness might be what preserved Athens through its troubles. If the city maintained proper respect for the gods, then perhaps the gods would not abandon the city entirely, even if they might punish specific failures or offenses. She did what she could, performing rituals with extra care, accepting offerings and presenting them to the goddess, speaking words of comfort and encouragement to those who came seeking help. But she also understood the limits of what religious practice could accomplish. The gods were not servants who could be compelled to do human bidding. She felt the weight of their need, their expectation that somehow she and her fellow priestesses could channel divine favor to address mortal problems. This understanding deepened Chrysanthe's spiritual maturity. She moved beyond a simple transactional view of religion, the idea that correct offerings and rituals automatically guaranteed desired outcomes, and toward a more profound acceptance of mystery and limitation. They were powers beyond complete human understanding, operating according to their own logic, their own purposes. Human beings could seek to maintain proper relationships with the divine, could try to live in ways that merited divine favor, but ultimately the gods would do as they chose, and mortals had to accept that with humility and courage. As she moved through her 20s and into her 30s, Chrysanthe became increasingly respected within the religious community. Younger priestesses looked to her for guidance and training. Officials responsible for organizing festivals consulted with her about proper procedures. Ordinary citizens, when they had questions about religious matters, sought her out for answers and advice. She learned to hold paradoxes, to believe deeply in the importance of ritual, while acknowledging that ritual could not control reality, to trust in divine providence, while recognizing that bad things happen to good people in cities, to maintain hope without falling into naive optimism. The seasons turned, each with its own character and requirements. Spring brought renewal, the earth awakening from winter dormancy, flowers blooming on the slopes of the Acropolis, birds returning from their winter migrations. Spring festivals celebrated fertility and renewal, the hope of new growth, the victory of life over death. Summer brought intense heat, the landscape drying to brown and gold, the sun beating down relentlessly from a sky bleached nearly white by its brightness. But summer also brought the Panathenea, the climax of the religious year, when all Athens came together to honor its patron goddess. She carried this authority lightly, without arrogance, understanding that her knowledge and status were not personal achievements, but gifts entrusted to her by the goddess and the community. Chrysanthe loved spring, loved the warm sun after the cold and rain of winter, loved the fresh green of new growth, loved the energy and optimism that seemed to infuse everyone during this season. Autumn brought cooler temperatures, the first rains after the long, dry summer, the time for planting crops that would grow through the winter and be harvested in late spring. Autumn festivals often focused on agricultural concerns, on ensuring divine favor for the crops being planted, on giving thanks for harvest completed. Winter brought cold rain, occasionally even snow on the mountains visible from Athens, shorter days and longer nights. Winter was a time for indoor work, for weaving and preparing for the festivals that would come with spring's return. It was a time for reflection, for studying and teaching, for the deep inner work that complemented the more outward focus of the warmer seasons. Despite the heat and the enormous effort required, Chrysanthi loved the great festival, loved the pageantry and celebration, loved the sense of collective purpose and shared devotion that united the entire city. Chrysanthi appreciated autumn's gentler light, the way the angle of the sun made the marble temples glow with a softer, warmer color than summer's harsh brightness. Through all these seasons, through all the years, the daily round of ritual and prayer continued. Chrysanthi found that the repetition, rather than becoming boring or meaningless, actually deepened in significance over time. Each performance of a familiar ritual brought new understanding, new nuance. The words she had spoken hundreds of times suddenly revealed new meanings. Chrysanthi loved the cozy feeling of being inside during winter storms, the warmth of a brazier, the intimacy of gathering close with her fellow priestesses, working together while rain drummed on the roof. She came to understand that tradition was not dead weight from the past, but a living stream that connected her to all who had come before and all who would come after. When she performed a ritual, she joined her voice to the voices of priestesses stretching back to the founding of Athens and forward to priestesses yet unborn. The gestures she had made countless times took on new depth. It was like a musician playing a familiar piece and discovering new subtleties with each performance, or a reader returning to a beloved text and seeing things that had somehow been invisible before. This understanding brought a deep peace that sustained Chrysanthi even through difficult times. When war brought suffering and loss, when plague ravaged the city, when political upheaval threatened Athens' stability, she had this bedrock of meaning and purpose to sustain her. She thought often of Athena, trying to understand the goddess more deeply. Athena was virgin but not sterile, representing a kind of creativity and fruitfulness that did not depend on sexuality. She gave birth not to children, but to ideas, to arts and crafts, to wisdom itself. She was participating in something larger than any individual life, something that transcended the limitations of mortal existence and touched the eternal. Her life mattered, not because of personal achievement or recognition, but because she was faithfully maintaining the sacred traditions that connected Athens to its divine patron and to the cosmic order itself. Chrysanthi saw herself as participating in this divine creativity. Through her weaving, she brought order and beauty out of simple threads. Through her teaching, she helped transmit wisdom and skill to new generations. She understood that her choice to remain unmarried and childless was not a rejection of fertility, but a different expression of it. She would have no physical children, but she had many spiritual children, the young girls she trained, the traditions she preserved and passed forward. She embodied a principle of intelligent ordering, of bringing civilization out of chaos, of elevating humans above mere animal existence through the gifts of craft, strategy, and law. Through her faithful maintenance of ritual, she helped sustain the ordering principles that allowed Athens to function as a civilized community rather than descending into violence and chaos. As Chrysanthi moved into her 40s and then her 50s, she became one of the elder priestesses, one of the keepers of tradition and memory. She had served Athena for decades now, had participated in ritual life through times of prosperity and crisis, had witnessed enormous changes in Athens and the wider Greek world. Younger priestesses came to her with questions, seeking her guidance on proper procedures, asking her to clarify points of theology or mythology, requesting her help in understanding how to handle new situations in ways consistent with tradition. Her fruitfulness was of a different kind, but no less real or important than that of women who married and raised families. She carried within her an immense body of knowledge, accumulated through years of practice and study, knowledge that made her invaluable to the religious community. She also served as a mentor in a deeper sense, helping younger women navigate the challenges of religious service. She understood from her own experience how difficult it could be to maintain dedication over many years, how easy it was to let practice become merely mechanical, losing touch with the spiritual reality that should animate all ritual. She answered patiently, drawing on her deep well of experience, always trying to help them understand not just what to do, but why, helping them grasp the principles that underlay specific practices so they could make wise decisions even in situations for which there was no clear precedent. She talked with them about the loneliness that could come from living a life set apart from ordinary society, about the ways that dedication to the gods could sometimes feel like sacrifice rather than fulfillment. She encouraged the younger priestesses to cultivate their inner lives, to spend time in meditation and prayer, to seek direct experience of divine presence rather than merely going through the motions of religious observance. In these conversations, Chrysanthi often felt that she was doing some of her most important work. The rituals mattered, certainly, but so did this human-to-human transmission of wisdom and encouragement. The religious life could not be learned simply by memorizing procedures and reciting prayers. It had to be lived, embodied, discovered through personal experience and reflection. She shared honestly about her own struggles and doubts, the times when she had questioned her choices, when she had felt tired of the endless repetition, when the divine presence had seemed distant or even absent. But she also shared how she had worked through these difficulties, how she had rediscovered meaning and purpose, how her commitment had deepened rather than diminished over time. As Athens dealt with the aftermath of its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, with occupation by Sparta, with political upheaval and the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants followed by restoration of democracy, the religious life of the city provided crucial continuity, and the guidance of elders who had walked the path before was essential to helping newcomers find their way. Chrysanthi took comfort in this perspective, even as she grieved for the suffering that war and political conflict brought. She saw young men die, families torn apart, dreams destroyed. She saw the material damage to the city, the long walls torn down, the treasury depleted, the empire lost. Governments changed, leaders came and went, the city's fortunes rose and fell, but the temples remained, the festivals continued, the gods were still honored. This continuity reminded Athenians that their city was more than just a political entity, that it had a sacred identity and purpose that transcended any particular historical moment. She witnessed during these years a deepening of religious feeling, as people turned to the gods for comfort and meaning that the political world could no longer provide. She saw increased interest in mystery religions that promised personal salvation and direct experience of the divine. She saw philosophical movements that sought to understand the relationship between human and divine in new ways. Through all of this, Chrysanthi remained faithful to her original commitment, serving Athena according to the ancient traditions. She recognized that the world was changing, that the religious landscape was becoming more complex, but she believed deeply in the value of maintaining the traditional practices that had sustained Athens for centuries. But she also saw the resilience of the community, the way people continued to gather for festivals, continued to honor the gods, continued to find meaning in shared ritual and tradition, even when so much else had been taken from them. She saw both a fragmentation of the old civic religion that had been so central to Greek life, and also new forms of religious expression emerging. As she grew older, moving into her 60s and then her 70s, Chrysanthi's body began to show the effects of age. Her joints ached, especially in cold weather, making the long periods of standing during rituals more challenging. Her eyesight weakened, making detailed work at the loom more difficult. She began to think more about her own mortality, about the fact that her years of service would eventually come to an end. She thought about who would carry on the traditions she had worked so hard to preserve and pass forward. She intensified her work with the younger priestesses, trying to ensure that everything she knew would be transmitted to the next generation. She was not opposed to new forms of religious expression, but she saw her role as preserving continuity, being an anchor in turbulent times, maintaining the connection to Athens' sacred past. Her voice, while still clear, lacked some of the power and range it had possessed in her youth. But her mind remained sharp, her memory intact, her spiritual depth greater than ever. She spoke of the importance of maintaining the proper spirit of service, of not letting the forms become empty, of continually seeking deeper understanding and more genuine connection with the divine. She spoke of the need for both reverence and intelligence, for following tradition faithfully while also being able to adapt when circumstances genuinely required it. As her body grew frailier, Chrysanthi spent more time in quiet contemplation, less time in active physical labor. She could no longer stand for hours during lengthy rituals, so younger priestesses took on those duties while Chrysanthi sat nearby. Her presence itself a blessing, her accumulated wisdom and holiness radiating from her like light from a flame. She told stories of her own training, of the priestesses who had taught her, trying to give the younger women a sense of connection to the long lineage of women who had served Athena on the sacred hill. She spoke of the balance between the outer forms of ritual and the inner spiritual reality that the forms were meant to express and facilitate. In these late years, she experienced a profound simplicity. All the complexities of ritual and theology, all the intricate details of proper procedure that had occupied so much of her attention in earlier years, seemed to distill down to something very simple and very profound. It was about love. She spent long hours before the ancient statue of Athena, sitting in silence, her mind clear and open, resting in the presence of the goddess she had served for so many decades. Love for the goddess, love for the city and its people, love for the traditions that connected past and future, love for the beauty of the world that the gods had made and continued to sustain. On quiet mornings, when mist rose from the harbor and wrapped the Acropolis in soft gray veils, when the marble temples seemed to float between earth and sky, Chrysanthi would sit and feel herself part of something vast and eternal. Her individual life was like a single drop in the great ocean of existence, but it was connected to all the other drops, part of the same whole. She understood that all the rituals, all the offerings and prayers, all the careful maintenance of sacred spaces were expressions of this love. They were ways of saying to the divine, "You matter to us, we honor you, we remember you, we live our lives in relationship to you." And in return, the gods blessed the city, sustained the cosmic order, gave meaning and purpose to human existence. She thought sometimes of the girl she had been, the child in her father's workshop, watching her mother at the loom, listening to stories of gods and heroes. That child still lived somewhere inside her, unchanged by all the years and experiences. When she died, her body would return to the earth, but the work she had done would continue through those she had trained and their students after them, an endless chain of faithful service stretching forward into a future she would never see but had helped to make possible. She felt gratitude, profound and overflowing, for the life she had been given, for the privilege of serving, for the beauty she had witnessed and helped to create, for the community of women who had shared this path with her, for the sense of meaning and purpose that had sustained her through all the challenges and changes. And she thought of the goddess Athena, who had guided her path, who had called her into this life of service, who had been present in every moment, even when Chrysanthi had not always been aware of that presence. As evening came and the sun descended toward the western sea, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Chrysanthi would make her way slowly to her small room, leaning on a staff now, her steps careful on the marble paths. She felt that her life had mattered, not in any grand historical way perhaps, but in the quiet persistence of daily faithfulness, in the small acts of devotion repeated year after year, in the care with which she had maintained the sacred traditions and passed them forward. She would prepare for sleep with the same ritual care she brought to every action, washing her hands and face, saying her evening prayers, arranging her few possessions neatly. She would lie down on her simple bed, pulling a woven blanket over herself, one she had made with her own hands many years ago, the wool soft and familiar. And as sleep approached, she would feel peace settling over her like the blanket, like the gathering darkness outside, like the gentle hand of the goddess herself. She would think of all the priestesses who had slept in, before light touches the highest peaks, before birds stir in their roofside nests. The Korean peninsula holds its breath in perfect darkness. Somewhere in this breathing silence, cradled by mountains whose names have been whispered for 1,000 years, a royal palace waits. Its curved roofs float like sleeping dragons against the starlit void. Tonight you are walking through gates that do not exist in your time. The stone guardians watch you pass with eyes that have witnessed the birth and death of empires. Their carved robes ripple in stillness. The scent of pine resin drifts through courtyards where no footfall yet disturbs the frost. Centuries of Joseon kings have walked these stones, their presence soaked into the wood and clay like rainfall into ancient earth. Let yourself become weightless now. Let the centuries fall away like silk scarves dropping to a polished floor. You are walking backward through time, through wars and peace, through the rise and fall of technologies that would have seemed like sorcery to these ancient courtiers. Beyond them, a world unfolds where time moves like honey, thick and golden, measured not by the anxious ticking of machines, but by the breathing of seasons, the patient turning of ritual, the slow dance between heaven and earth. The palace sleeps, but not completely. Even in deepest night, there is awareness here, a consciousness distributed through thousands of souls whose lives pulse in rhythm with something larger than themselves. In the guards' quarters, men breathe in unison, their dreams patrolling corridors their bodies have memorized. Keep walking until you reach a moment suspended in amber. A single day preserved perfect and whole, where every gesture carries the weight of meaning, where beauty and order flow together like water and moonlight. Darkness is never truly dark in a great palace. The stars press close here, undimmed by the electric ghosts that haunt your own time. They cast shadows pale as moth wings across the courtyards. The tiles on the sweeping roofs catch this starlight and hold it, glowing faintly green and gray, phosphorescent as deep-sea creatures. This palace is not one building, but a constellation, a city of wooden pavilions and stone platforms spreading across land so vast you could lose yourself for hours in its gardens and hidden courtyards. Each structure serves its purpose in the great machinery of kingship. Here the monarch sleeps. There his ministers debate matters of state. In the women's chambers, court ladies turn in sleep, their silk bedding rustling like leaves in autumn wind. In the kitchens, embers glow like tiny suns, holding heat that will birth tomorrow's flames. Between the buildings, the empty spaces seem to hum with potential, pregnant with the activities that will fill them once light returns. The air tastes different here. Close your eyes and breathe it. Pine sap and incense, yes, but also something else. The smell of paper mulberry and rice paste, of silk kept in wooden chests, of stone that has absorbed centuries of rain and sun. The smell of careful living, of lives devoted to refinement and order. In that distant compound, court ladies practice arts that transform silk and ink and sound into beauty that makes the heart ache. And everywhere, connecting everything, corridors and courtyards and covered walkways that trace invisible lines of power and protocol across the ground. Every breath you take carries particles of this vanished world. Atoms that once constituted the robes of queens, the dinner of scholars, the lamp oil that burned while poets composed verses about separation and longing. In the guards' quarters, before consciousness fully returns, hands reach for weapons that lie always within grasp. These men have trained until waking and readiness are the same thing. They rise from their sleeping mats with movements that cost no wasted effort, flowing like water, finding its path downhill. Their padded jackets, hanging on wooden pegs, slide over their shoulders. The outgoing watch and incoming watch meet in a courtyard paved with stones so old their surfaces have become smooth as skin. They stand in formation as they have stood 10,000 times before. No order needed. The night watch gestures to the day watch, indicating that all is well, that the palace has been kept safe through another night. In the deepest hour, when even the stars seem to hold still, something shifts. It is not yet visible, not yet audible, but somehow the palace knows. Dawn is coming. The wheel is turning. Another cycle begins. The fabric smells of sweat and lanolin and the particular cold that comes from standing motionless in winter darkness. Their spears catch the last starlight. The metal gleams like captured ice. Each guard carries his weapon as naturally as he carries his own skeleton, the haft an extension of his arm, the blade an extension of his will. They take pride in this, in their readiness, in their place in the great pattern. The day watch nods, accepting this responsibility as their ancestors accepted it, as their children's children will accept it, an unbroken chain of protection stretching into a future they cannot imagine. The kitchens wake differently, with fire and purpose. The head cook arrives when the night is still absolute. He has walked this path so many times his feet know every stone, every slight unevenness that might trip a careless walker. In his mind, he is already preparing the day's meals, sorting through recipes memorized over decades of service. He strikes flint in darkness, kneeling before the great hearth that dominates the kitchen like an altar. The first spark is an act of creation, light coming into being where before there was only potential. The kindling catches, tentative at first, then growing confident. Small flames lick at the larger wood. When they die, which most will do in their beds after years of uneventful service, they will be buried with honor as men who stood between chaos and order, between the kingdom and whatever darkness pressed against its borders. His hands know the weight of every ingredient, the texture of perfect rice, the give of properly aged kimchi, the resistance of raw vegetables that must be cut just so. Other cooks arrive as if summoned by the firelight. They appear from the darkness outside, entering the expanding circle of illumination. Each knows without asking what tasks await them. The woman who specializes in vegetable cutting takes her place at the long wooden table, its surface carved into valleys by generations of knives. The head cook feeds the fire with the care of a parent tending a child, adding fuel gradually, never rushing, allowing the fire to establish itself according to its own nature. The sound of pounding rice becomes the palace's heartbeat. Thump and pause, and thump and pause. Patient, endless. The grain transforms under this patient violence, breaking down, releasing its essence, becoming something new while remaining itself. The apprentice's arms grow tired, but they do not stop. The man responsible for soups begins heating water in bronze cauldrons that could swallow a person whole. The apprentices, youngest and least skilled, begin grinding rice in stone mortars, the pestles rising and falling with a rhythm that is almost music, almost prayer. Water drawn from palace wells fills enormous ceramic vessels. This water has filtered through earth and stone, has absorbed the mountain's minerals, has been transformed from rain to something purer. The cooks use it without thought, but in truth this water is a gift, one link in the vast chain of gifts that sustains this place. Farmers grew the rice. Merchants transported it. There is pride in this work, in feeding the king, in participating however humbly in the great enterprise of maintaining the kingdom. Their sweat falls into the mortars and no one minds. Everything here is given in service. As the kitchen grows warm with fire and industry, as the first light begins to soften the eastern sky from black to midnight blue, the rhythms of preparation deepen. Vegetables are washed until they squeak clean. Fish are gutted, their scales catching lamplight like scattered silver coins. Mushrooms are sorted, their earth smell mixing with everything else. The royal meals are philosophy made edible. Each dish balances the 5 elements: harmonizes conflicting energies, demonstrates the kingdom's prosperity through careful abundance. Nothing is wasted, but nothing is stinted either. The middle path manifests in ceramic bowls and bronze vessels. Tax collectors gathered it. Administrators recorded it. And now cooks will transform it into porridge that will nourish the king's body, and through him nourish the body politic, the kingdom itself. The kitchen becomes a laboratory where base materials transform into sustenance through heat and skill and time-tested knowledge passed down from master to student in an unbroken lineage. In the royal chambers, a different kind of awakening unfolds. Here, silence is deeper, more complete. The king's eunuchs move through outer rooms like ghosts, their felt shoes whispering against oiled paper floors. They carry lamps that cast amber light across walls decorated with paintings of mountains and cranes, symbols of longevity and transcendence. These eunuchs, neither one thing nor another in the rigid categories of the society, have made their peace with what they are, or most have, or they act as if they have, which in the end amounts to the same thing. They serve because serving gives their lives structure and meaning. The king will eat, and in eating will consume not just food but the care of his people, the devotion of his servants, the ordering principle of the cosmos itself, made manifest in steamed rice and carefully aged kimchi. The painted mountains seem to recede into infinite distance, as if the walls themselves have become portals to other realms. The senior eunuch, his face a landscape of wrinkles earned through decades of discretion, pauses outside the king's inner chamber. He listens. The quality of silence tells him the king is already awake, has been awake perhaps for an hour, lying in darkness with his thoughts. A king's mind never truly rests. They attend the king because proximity to power, even when one cannot wield it directly, is better than invisibility in the world beyond these walls. Some wield influence through subtlety and intelligence. Others find satisfaction in simply performing their duties with grace. The eunuch announces dawn with a voice like silk drawn across wood. The king rises from his sleeping platform, his movements stiff from the intentional discomfort of the bed. Confucian wisdom holds that too much comfort weakens the will, that slight suffering sharpens the mind. The king has slept this way since childhood, when his father began preparing him for the throne. Even in sleep, the weight of the kingdom presses down, infiltrating dreams, turning them toward questions of governance and duty. His body knows no other rest. The robes come in layers, each with its own name and purpose. First, undergarments of fine cotton, soft against the skin. Then silk layers, building up, creating the silhouette that proclaims his status before he speaks a word. Ganryong Pur, that outer robe of deepest blue embroidered with golden dragons, slides over his shoulders with a weight of responsibility. Warm water waits in a bronze basin that reflects lamplight in rippling patterns. The king washes his face, the water hot enough to make his skin tingle. This simple act, repeated every morning of his life, centers him. The water runs over his skin and carries away the night's confusion. He emerges refreshed, ready to don the elaborate costume that will transform him from a man into a symbol. The dragons writhe across his chest and back, their 5 claws grasping at clouds, their scales catching light, their eyes seeming to hold intelligence and judgment. Across the palace, in the queen's quarters, court ladies enact parallel rituals. The queen rises from her own sleeping platform in rooms fragrant with sandalwood and the particular smell of women's spaces, powder and silk, and carefully applied cosmetics. Her court ladies attend her with practiced efficiency born of years serving together. The jade belt settles around his waist, heavy and cool. The crown, Ixomwan, transforms his head into something architectural, something beyond the merely human. When he looks in the bronze mirror, the face that looks back is his and not his. He sees the king looking back. The man who woke in darkness has been subsumed into the role, dissolved into duty like salt into water. These women have given up much to serve here. Families, marriages, children of their own. They entered the palace as girls and will leave it, if they leave it at all, as old women. Their lives unfold entirely within these walls, circumscribed by protocol and propriety. Yet they find freedom within these constraints. The queen's clothing transforms her body into a geometry of silk and color. Jugori, that fitted jacket, chima, the voluminous skirt, create a silhouette that seems to float above the floor. Her hair, dressed with ornamental pins of jade and silver, becomes a sculpture. Each pin has meaning. Each placement follows rules refined over centuries. They know her preferences without asking, anticipate her needs before she voices them. They become accomplished in arts that would have been denied them in the world outside. They wield influence through the queen, shaping events they could never touch directly. They form bonds with each other that run deeper than blood, forged in the shared crucible of palace service. Throughout the palace grounds, other transformations occur as darkness yields to dawn. Junior officials arrive at their offices in buildings dedicated to the machinery of governance. These men, products of decades of study, carry their education like invisible armor. When she moves, the pins chime softly against each other, a private music that follows her like a shadow. They take their places at low desks arranged in neat rows. The rooms smell of paper and ink and the particular mustiness of spaces filled with documents. Some of these papers record events from generations ago, carefully preserved, available for consultation when historical precedent is needed. The continuity matters. They have memorized thousands of Chinese characters, absorbed the Confucian classics until they can quote them in their sleep, learn to write with brushwork that is itself a form of meditation. They have survived the brutal examination system that separates the fit from the unfit, the dedicated from the merely ambitious. The kingdom remembers itself through these documents, maintains its identity across generations through written records that survive when memory fails and human flesh returns to earth. The sound of brush on paper is like rain on leaves, a soft, persistent whisper that fills the administrative buildings. Officials write reports, copy regulations, draft responses to petitions from distant provinces. The bureaucracy never sleeps. There are always more documents to process, more cases to review, more problems demanding attention. Fresh ink is ground each morning the apprentices rotating ink sticks against stone dishes, adding water drop by drop until the consistency is perfect. Too thick and the characters will blob and bleed. Too thin and they will look weak, uncertain. The ink must be black as midnight, dense as packed earth. When a brush touches paper, the characters that emerge carry weight and authority. Dawn breaks completely now, the sky shifting through shades of blue to pink to gold. The sun, still below the horizon, sends advanced messengers of light to announce its coming. The palace, which has been gradually assembling itself from darkness, suddenly becomes visible all at once. The curved roofs glow. The painted pillars, vermilion and green and gold, seem to pulse with their own light. Birds burst into song, a cascade of sound that pours from every roof and tree. Crows and magpies, those bold and clever birds that thrive near human habitation, begin their daily routines of scavenging and gossip. They hop along roof ridges, tilting their heads to observe the humans below with amused skepticism. The kingdom is vast, its people numerous, their needs endless. The machinery grinds on, fueled by these men hunched over their desks, transforming ink into governance. The stone courtyards, empty and expectant, wait to receive the day's activities like vessels waiting to be filled. The palace gardens, those carefully composed landscapes where every rock and tree has been positioned to create harmony, emerge from shadow into definition. The ponds, which have held darkness like vessels hold water, now reflect the brightening sky. The reflection trembles and breaks and reforms as fish rise to the surface, their mouths opening and closing, feeding on insects too small to see. Willows trail their branches in the water, creating patterns of light and shadow that shift with every breath of wind. These trees, planted by gardeners long dead, have grown into the shapes intended for them, trained over decades into living sculptures. Their roots drink from the pond, while their leaves drink from sun. In their black eyes, the palace is simply a good source of dropped food and comfortable nesting sites. They care nothing for dynasties and protocols. This democratic indifference is somehow comforting. The fish are carp, some of them older than the youngest officials, swimming in lazy circles through water so clear you can count the scales on their sides. In one secluded corner, a lotus pond holds its treasures close. The broad leaves float like green plates on a water surface. Where flowers have bloomed in the proper season, their petals are white as enlightenment, pink as dawn, rising above the mud from which they grew to open unsullied in the light. The lotus sermon speaks without words. They stand at the boundary between elements, belonging fully to neither water nor air, but participating in both. To see it is to understand that purity need not depend on pure origins, that beauty can emerge from darkness, that the soul can rise above its circumstances through patient striving toward light. The officials arrange themselves in perfect formation, civil on the east, military on the west. Their robes create a rainbow of rank and function. Purple for the highest ministers, red for those just below, blue and green cascading down through the hierarchy until the lowest ranks stand in simple white. On their chests and backs, Embroidered badges proclaim their positions. A unicorn here. The morning court assembly begins with silence. Officials gather in the vast courtyard before the main throne hall. This building, largest and most magnificent in the entire complex, sits elevated on a stone platform like a mountain rising from the earth. Its scale is meant to overwhelm, to remind all who approach of the monarchy's power and the cosmic order it represents. They stand motionless as statues, hundreds of men frozen in respectful attention. Their discipline is absolute but not harsh. This is ritual as meditation, stillness as practice. They have trained their bodies to ignore discomfort, their minds to achieve a state of alert calm that can be maintained for hours. In this standing stillness, individual consciousness dissolves into collective purpose. A tiger there, various birds and mythical creatures, each precisely signifying the bearer's place in the intricate status system. They become the kingdom's ministers, not separate people with separate lives, but organs in a single body dedicated to governance and harmony. He enters from the rear of the hall, walking with measured pace, each step deliberate and weighted. His dragon robes flow around him like water, like smoke, like the very air made visible. The officials bow as one, a wave of reverence rippling through the assembled ranks. Their foreheads nearly touch the stone. The bronze bell sounds, deep and resonant, its voice rolling across the courtyard like thunder across mountains. The note hangs in the air impossibly long, decaying so gradually it seems it might never entirely fade. In that suspended moment, time itself holds still. Then the king appears. The throne sits against a screen painted with 5 peaks and the sun and moon. This is not decoration, but cosmology made visible. The 5 peaks represent the kingdom's sacred mountains, those points where earth reaches toward heaven. The sun and moon embody the dual forces that govern existence, yang and yin, male and female, light and dark, each necessary, each incomplete without the other. When the officials straighten from their bows, morning court begins its predictable dance. The chief state counselor steps forward, the highest-ranking official in the government, a man whose hair has gone white in service. His voice, trained to project without shouting, carries clearly through the enormous hall. Reports flow like a river. The Ministry of Personnel details appointments to provincial positions, ensuring that qualified men serve in every corner of the kingdom. The Ministry of Revenue provides figures on tax collection, granary levels, the economic pulse of the nation. The Ministry of Rites discusses upcoming ceremonies, those ritual performances that connect the human world to the realm of ancestors and heaven. The Ministry of War addresses border security and military readiness, the necessary evil of force that makes possible the peace in which culture flourishes. They hold this position, uncomfortable and absolute, until the king reaches his throne and settles himself there. The king sits at the center of this painted cosmos, the human axis around which all else revolves. He speaks in formal register, using honorifics that elevate the discourse above ordinary speech, transforming conversation into ceremony. Each minister speaks precisely, wasting neither words nor time. They have prepared their reports with care, stripping away everything unnecessary while retaining everything essential. The king listens with focused attention, his face revealing nothing, his questions sharp and penetrating when he chooses to speak. The Ministry of Justice brings cases for royal judgment, questions of law that require wisdom beyond mere regulation. The Ministry of Public Works reports on roads and bridges and irrigation projects, the physical infrastructure that allows commerce and communication to flow unimpeded. Debates arise when officials disagree on policy. Should trade restrictions be loosened to increase prosperity or maintained to protect traditional values from foreign contamination? Should taxes in drought-affected regions be reduced to ease suffering or maintained to ensure fairness with other regions and preserve government revenues? These questions have no perfect answers. He has been trained since childhood for this, taught to process information rapidly, to perceive patterns and implications, to separate the important from the merely urgent. The Confucian system encourages remonstration, even demands it. Officials who see the king erring have not just the right, but the obligation to speak. To remain silent when one perceives injustice or mistake is to fail in one's duty, to value personal comfort over loyalty to principle. Of course, the manner of speaking matters immensely. One must criticize policy while honoring the person. These debates, conducted in formal language before the assembled court, represent Korean political philosophy in action. Power is not absolute in the simplistic sense. The king rules within a web of constraints, checked by tradition, by law, by the moral authority of the scholar officials, by institutions that exist specifically to monitor and criticize government performance. Governance requires choosing between imperfect options, accepting that every decision creates winners and losers, that justice itself is often a matter of balancing competing goods rather than choosing between obvious right and obvious wrong. One must argue forcefully while maintaining perfect respect. The line is narrow, and officials who misjudge can find themselves dismissed or worse. The morning light streams through the hall's large windows, casting geometric patterns across the floor. The painted ceiling, covered in intricate designs of clouds and flowers and mythical creatures, seems to glow from within. Dragons coil through painted clouds. Phoenixes spread their wings. Lotuses bloom in endless profusion. Outside in the courtyard, lower-ranking officials maintain their standing vigil. They cannot hear the debates inside the hall, cannot participate directly in governance, yet their presence matters. They witness. They embody the kingdom's vast administrative apparatus. An ideal Confucian king does not simply command, but persuades, does not merely rule, but exemplifies virtue that inspires voluntary compliance. The artisans who created this visual symphony spent months or years on scaffolds, necks aching, eyes straining, brushes finding exactly the right curve, exactly the right shade, transforming wood and pigment into frozen music. Time moves differently here than in the urgent modern world you came from. Nothing is rushed. Each action receives the attention it deserves. When morning court concludes after 2 hours, it concludes completely, not interrupted by the next thing, but allowed to settle like dust after wind. The king rises. Officials bow again, holding the position until he exits through the private doorway. The king returns to his quarters but does not rest. After tea and light food, he receives smaller groups for detailed discussions. Today, it is scholars from the Royal Confucian Academy, men dedicated to preserving and advancing learning. They gather in a smaller pavilion where the atmosphere is more intimate, though no less formal. When the session ends and higher officials disperse to their departments, these junior men will return to their desks where the real work continues. The endless processing of documents and cases and petitions that keeps the machinery functioning. Then they straighten, breathe, begin to move, separating back into individuals with individual concerns. The scholars have prepared a discussion of a passage from the Doctrine of the Mean, one of the 4 books at the heart of Confucian education. The text before them is ancient, its wisdom filtered through centuries of commentary. Today's passage concerns sincerity, that fundamental quality from which all virtue flows. Without sincerity, the text argues, nothing can be accomplished. The scholars take turns offering interpretations, their voices calm and measured. They reference earlier commentaries, draw parallels with other texts, connect ancient wisdom to contemporary situations. The king listens and occasionally asks questions that reveal his own deep engagement with these ideas. There is pleasure in this intellectual exchange, a satisfaction different from the pleasures of power or luxury. Ideas have their own beauty, their own elegance when expressed with precision and clarity. Books line the walls, their pages hand-copied by scribes who spent lifetimes transforming ink into knowledge. With sincerity, even heaven and earth respond to one's efforts. This is his education continuing, lifelong learning that began in childhood and will end only with death. A king who stops learning becomes a tyrant, his understanding frozen while the world changes around him. Outside, the palace continues its complex choreography. In the royal kitchens, the midday meal preparation reaches its crescendo. Fires burn hot under enormous cauldrons. Soups bubble and steam. On long wooden tables, ingredients are being transformed through the application of heat and time and skill passed down through generations of cooks. The men in this room are engaged in a conversation that extends across centuries, speaking to and with the ancient sages, adding their own small contributions to a tradition larger than any individual life. When they die, others will take their places, continuing the discussion, keeping the wisdom alive and relevant. A cook who specializes in fish works with extraordinary speed and precision. Fresh fish, brought from the coast packed in ice from the royal ice houses, are cleaned and portioned. His knife moves so quickly it blurs. Each cut is exactly where it needs to be. No motion is wasted. He has performed these actions 10,000 times, his hands knowing what his mind barely needs to consider. Another cook focuses entirely on vegetables, transforming humble ingredients into small masterpieces. Korean cuisine has refined vegetable preparation in a high art. Kimchi alone exists in dozens of variations, each with its own character and purpose. Some are fiery with red pepper, their heat building gradually until it fills your entire head. The air is thick with competing smells, fish and vegetables and spices creating an olfactory symphony. The fish becomes fillets, uniform and perfect, ready for grilling or steaming or incorporation into the elaborate soups that will grace the royal table. The rice for the king's meal is treated with religious care. It comes from paddies in the kingdom's most fertile regions, each grain inspected and selected. It is washed repeatedly until the water runs absolutely clear, then soaked to allow the grains to absorb moisture evenly. Others are mild and subtle, allowing the natural flavors of cabbage or radish to dominate. All are products of fermentation, that mysterious process where time and bacteria collaborate to create tastes impossible to achieve through cooking alone. Servers prepare the vessels that will transport food from kitchen to royal quarters. These vessels are themselves works of art. White porcelain bowls, their surfaces so pure they seem to glow from within, will hold dishes whose colors create deliberate contrasts. Blue and white ceramics display delicate painted designs, landscapes and flowers rendered in cobalt under the glaze. When steamed, the rice must achieve a texture that is somehow both firm and yielding, each grain separate yet cohesive, glistening but not wet. This is rice as it was meant to be, rice as few people ever tasted, rice that has been elevated from mere food to art. The royal table, when fully assembled, becomes a landscape of abundance. 12 dishes for a formal meal, the number representing completeness and cosmic order. Various kimchi, their colors ranging from white to crimson. Grilled meats and fish, their surfaces caramelized and glistening. Steamed vegetables retaining their bright colors and crisp textures. Bronze vessels, their surfaces patinated with age, will hold soups in larger portions. Small dishes of jade and lacquerware contain sauces and condiments, each contributing its note to the complex harmony of a meal. Elaborate stews with broths so rich they coat your tongue. Numerous small side dishes providing contrasting flavors and textures, salty and sweet, crunchy and soft, hot and cool. The king eats with others, never alone. For Confucian propriety recognizes that solitary dining can lead to imbalance and excessive self-focus. Today he dines with the queen, the two of them seated across from each other at a low table. Conversation is minimal, focus remaining on the food and the act of eating. The arrangement follows strict protocols. Certain dishes always occupy certain positions relative to the rice and soup bowls. The pattern is not arbitrary, but reflects principles of harmony and balance derived from both Confucian philosophy and traditional culinary wisdom. The meal becomes a physical manifestation of cosmic order, nourishment for body and spirit simultaneously. A court physician observes discreetly, noting the king's appetite and preferences. These observations inform health decisions. Traditional Korean medicine, rooted in Chinese medical theory, but adapted to Korean circumstances, views health as balance. Foods have thermal properties, some heating the body, others cooling it. Meals should maintain internal equilibrium. After the midday meal, a brief rest period follows. The king may recline in his chambers, allowing the food to settle, his mind to drift without particular focus. This alternation between activity and rest reflects understanding that human beings cannot function optimally in a single mode. Yang and Yin must alternate. Effort must be balanced by recovery. To push without pause leads to depletion. Mindful consumption, attention to flavors and textures, gratitude for the labor that brought this food from field and sea to this table. Too much of any one energy creates disease. Proper diet, combined with adequate rest and appropriate exercise, keeps the body in harmony with itself and with the changing seasons. In the women's quarters, court ladies gather for their own afternoon activities. Though excluded from official governance, these women nonetheless cultivate themselves through study and practice of various arts. Some work on poetry, reading classics, and composing new verses. Korean poetry in this era draws from both indigenous traditions and Chinese forms. Their poems often explore themes of separation and longing, for palace life means living apart from family and the wider world. They write about the changing seasons, finding in nature's cycles metaphors for human emotions and experiences. A willow bending in wind becomes a metaphor for resilience. Falling cherry blossoms evoke the transience of beauty and youth. To rest without effort leads to stagnation. The art of living well requires finding the rhythm that allows both maximum effectiveness and sustainable health. The most accomplished women can compose in both Korean and classical Chinese, that shared written language that connects educated people across East Asia. Other court ladies practice painting, using ink and brush to capture the essence of subjects rather than their literal appearance. Korean painting tends towards simplicity compared to more decorative Chinese styles. Empty space becomes as important as brushwork. A few swift strokes suggest an entire bamboo forest. A bird on a branch is indicated rather than fully depicted. Embroidery occupies still other women, their needles pulling colored silk threads through fabric, building up images stitched by microscopic stitch. A single piece might require months or years to complete. The finished works, used as decorative panels or incorporated into ceremonial garments, demonstrate both technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication. The moon, that eternal companion of poets, reflects their own isolation and longing, shining down equally on the palace and on distant homes they can no longer visit. The artist seeks to capture the inner nature of things, their essential quality, leaving everything else to the viewer's imagination. Music fills other hours. Korean traditional music, with its unique scales and structures, creates soundscapes utterly unlike Western music. Jie Yagum, a long zither with movable bridges, plucked to produce notes that can be bent and embellished with vibrato. Daegum, a large bamboo flute, has a distinctive breathy tone created by a membrane that vibrates against one of the finger holes. Court ladies who specialize in music practice both instrumental performance and singing. The songs they learn include folk melodies refined for court performance and elaborate compositions created specifically for ritual occasions. From a distance, embroidery can look like painting. Only close inspection reveals that what appears to be brushstrokes is actually thousands of individual stitches, each precisely placed, together creating an illusion of continuous surface. Various percussion instruments provide rhythmic foundation, drums and wooden clappers marking patterns that can be hypnotically complex. As afternoon deepens, the king may engage in archery practice. Archery is not merely a military skill, but a form of spiritual cultivation. The act of drawing a bow, focusing on the target, releasing the arrow becomes a meditation on intention and execution, on the alignment of inner purpose with outer action. When the king or queen desires entertainment, these women perform, their music seeming to come from another realm entirely, ancient and haunting and deeply moving, each note carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. The palace maintains an archery range where targets are set at prescribed distances and contestants shoot according to formal rules. Each shot follows a ritual sequence. Feet positioned just so, body aligned toward the target. The bow rises, the string is drawn back to the ear, breathing slows, mind narrows its focus to a single point. Everything else falls away. There's only the bow, the arrow, the target, and the intention to unite them. The king, accompanied by attendants and perhaps a few officials, takes his position at the shooting line. The bow he holds is a composite construction, layers of horn and wood and sinew shaped and cured over years to achieve optimal strength and flexibility. The arrows are equally carefully crafted, their shafts straight as truth, their tips perfectly balanced. Whether the arrow strikes the center matters less than the quality of form demonstrated. A near miss with perfect technique and proper mindset is more valuable than a lucky hit achieved with poor form. This is archery as meditation, each shot an opportunity to refine oneself, to eliminate internal obstacles that prevent clear expression of intention. Beyond the formal archery range, in wilder sections of the palace grounds, medicinal gardens grow under careful supervision. Physicians and herbalists tend these beds where therapeutic plants flourish. Traditional Korean medicine relies heavily on plant materials, supplemented with animal products and minerals. The release happens almost without volition, the arrow leaping forward, its flight a perfect arc through air. The practice is both physical and spiritual, training body and mind simultaneously toward a unity of purpose and action. This knowledge has accumulated over centuries, recorded in medical texts that are copied and studied by each generation of practitioners. The physicians possess extensive knowledge of which plants treat, which conditions, how they should be prepared, what dosages are appropriate, how different substances interact. Treatment might involve herbal decoctions, broths made by simmering combinations of dried plants for hours until water becomes saturated with their essences. Or acupuncture might be employed, fine needles inserted at specific points along the body's meridians to adjust the flow of qi, that vital energy that animates all living things. When someone in the palace falls ill, physicians examine the patient thoroughly, feeling pulses at various points on the wrist where different organ systems can be assessed, observing the tongue's coating and color, asking detailed questions about symptoms, diet, sleep patterns, emotional state. All medical intervention aims to restore balance. Illness is imbalance, a disruption in proper functioning. Health is not merely absence of disease, but a positive state of harmonious functioning where all elements work together smoothly. Energy flows freely. The body responds appropriately to changing circumstances. Or moxibustion, burning dried mugwort near the skin to provide warmth and stimulation to particular areas. The goal is not to suppress symptoms, but to address underlying imbalances, returning the patient to equilibrium. As afternoon continues, ceremonial obligations may be scheduled. The Joseon court maintains an elaborate calendar of rituals and observances, some daily, others weekly, monthly, seasonally, or annually. These ceremonies connect the royal court, and through it the entire kingdom, to cosmic order and to ancestors who came before. The Royal Ancestral Shrine, located in a specially constructed compound, houses memorial tablets representing former kings and queens. These tablets, simple wooden pieces inscribed with names and dates, serve as focal points for ritual attention. Ancestor veneration stands at the heart of Confucian practice. The belief is less about dead spirits actively intervening in worldly affairs than about maintaining connections between generations. Honoring ancestors reminds the living of their debt to those who came before, provides structure through which moral teachings and family identity pass down through time. Clothing worn for these ceremonies becomes even more formal and archaic than ordinary court dress, connecting participants to ancient traditions. Movements, spoken words, arrangement of offerings, everything follows patterns established long ago and preserved in detailed ritual texts. For participants, these ceremonies can be physically demanding, involving long periods of standing or kneeling, repeated deep bows, careful attention to coordination with others. Yet there's also something deeply satisfying about participating in rituals that connect one to such a long chain of human practice. On appropriate dates, elaborate ceremonies unfold with the current king leading officials in bows and offerings, music and chanting, everything performed with exact attention to proper form. To perform the ceremony correctly demonstrates understanding and respect for tradition, proclaims one's legitimacy as heir to authority and responsibilities passed down through generations. Beyond official state rituals, smaller ceremonies occur regularly throughout the palace. Each building, each gate, each significant location has its guardian spirits according to popular belief, and offerings may be made to maintain good relations with these spiritual presences. Generations ago, other kings stood in this same place, performing these same actions, speaking these same words. Generations hence, if the kingdom endures, other kings will do likewise. One becomes part of something vastly larger than oneself. Officially, the Joseon dynasty embraced Confucianism and marginalized Buddhism, which had dominated the previous Goryeo dynasty. Buddhist temples lost land and influence. Monks became marginalized figures. Yet Buddhism did not disappear. Royal women especially often kept Buddhist faith, perhaps because Buddhism offered more spiritual comfort and practices focused on personal salvation and transcendence, while Confucianism emphasized social roles and ethical behavior in relationships. The religious life of the palace, like that of Korean society generally, represents a complex blend of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and indigenous shamanic traditions. It remains strong in rural areas and mountains, and many people, including royal family members and courtiers, privately maintained Buddhist practices while publicly emphasizing Confucian values. Shamanic practices also persisted, particularly surrounding life transitions, births, deaths, illnesses, crises. Shamans, mudang, might be secretly summoned to perform rituals, communicating with spirits, diagnosing problems, providing spiritual remedies. As late afternoon arrives, preparations begin for the evening meal. In the royal quarters, this meal is somewhat less formal than the midday meal, but still elaborate. The king may dine with family members, enjoying brief respite from constant official obligations. Hidden in private quarters, small Buddhist altars might be maintained where women could offer incense and prayers, seeking blessings for their families or peace for deceased relatives. These practices existed in tension with rationalist Confucian worldview, yet people accommodated both, seeing no necessary contradiction between ethical philosophy and spiritual practices. Conversation during this meal might be somewhat more relaxed, discussing personal matters, family concerns, lighter topics than those that dominate morning court. Evening food tends toward warming, comforting dishes. Soups and stews, served bubbling hot, provide both nutrition and pleasure. Braised meats cooked slowly until tender fall apart at the touch of chopsticks. Seasonal vegetables simply prepared highlight their natural flavors, providing freshness and balance to richer dishes. Entertainment may be arranged for the king's pleasure. Musical performances by court musicians, either instrumental concerts or performances of courtly songs, or dancers might perform, moving with careful precision through choreographed sequences that tell stories or represent abstract principles. After the meal, as dusk approaches, the palace takes on different character. The bustle of daytime activity gradually subsides. Officials who do not reside in the palace depart through gates, returning to their homes in the surrounding city. Those who remain, residents and guards, and servants whose duties extend through night, settle into evening routines. Korean court dance is restrained compared to some traditions, emphasizing subtle movements, controlled gestures, the rustling sound of elaborate costumes. The king might also spend evening hours engaged in his own pursuits. Many Joseon kings were accomplished in various arts. Some were excellent calligraphers, spending hours practicing brushwork, copying classical texts, or composing their own writings. The practice of calligraphy was seen as revealing character. Sometimes scholars or officials, particularly skilled in conversation, might be invited to join the king for informal discussions. These evening conversations, freed from pressure of immediate decision-making, could range widely across topics: philosophy, history, literature, current events, even personal reflections. The way one held the brush, the confidence or hesitation visible in strokes, the balance and proportion of characters, all these supposedly reflected the inner state of the writer. Other kings painted, created poetry, or studied specialized subjects that interested them. Some monarchs involved themselves deeply in learning, creating innovations that benefited the kingdom. The pursuit of knowledge and self-cultivation was seen as essential to proper rulership. As full darkness settles over the palace, the night watch begins their duties in earnest. Lanterns are lit throughout the complex, creating pools of warm light against deep darkness. These lanterns, oiled paper stretched over wooden or bamboo frames, cast gentle glow that seems alive, flickering slightly with air currents. The palace at night becomes a place of shadows and whispers. The grand buildings, so impressive in daylight, now become mysterious presences, their dark roofs merging with night sky, their pillars like ancient tree trunks in a forest. Guards walking their rounds move quietly, alert for unusual sounds or movements. The night watch carries lanterns to light their way and torches that can serve as signals in case of emergency. They check that gates are properly secured, that no unauthorized persons are moving through restricted areas, that no fires have started accidentally in kitchens or workshops. Fire represents perhaps the greatest danger to the palace. Security is constant concern, though palace walls are high and strong. Though guards are posted at every gate, vigilance must remain constant. The king lives surrounded by protection, yet that protection must remain alert, never complacent, always aware that those seeking power might resort to desperate measures. In various buildings throughout the palace, smaller dramas unfold through the night. With so many wooden buildings in close proximity, a single fire could spread rapidly, becoming catastrophic. In quarters where lower-ranking court ladies sleep several to a room, some lie awake, unable to find rest, perhaps worried about family members outside the palace, perhaps nursing romantic feelings for someone they can never openly acknowledge. Perhaps simply restless with youth and energy constrained by rigid structure of palace life. In administrative offices, a few dedicated officials work late by lamplight, finishing documents that must be ready for the next day. The work of government never truly stops. There are always more reports to read, more letters to draft, more cases to analyze, more problems demanding solutions. In guards' quarters, those who have completed their shifts try to sleep despite discomfort of hard sleeping platforms and snoring comrades. Military discipline has trained them to sleep whenever possible, knowing opportunities for rest may be brief and irregular. In the royal kitchen compound, night workers maintain fires, keeping coals alive so morning cooking can begin quickly. They might prepare late-night refreshments in case the king or other high-ranking individuals desire something to eat during night hours. A simple soup or warm tea or light rice cakes might be kept ready. The palace waterways, small streams channeled through the grounds to provide water for various purposes, continue their quiet burbling. These waterways serve both practical and aesthetic functions, providing the sound of moving water that enhances garden atmosphere, while also supplying water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, fighting fires. In a pavilion near one of the larger ponds, a scholar unable to sleep has wandered out to sit and contemplate. The moon, nearly full, hangs above the palace, its light silvering tile roofs and reflecting in still water. The scholar finds himself composing poetry in his mind, playing with images of moonlight and water, separation and longing, duty and desire. In the women's quarters, an older court lady, one who has served for decades, sits by a small lamp doing embroidery. Her eyes are not what they once were, and this close work by limited light cannot be good for them. Yet she finds peace in repetitive motion of the needle, pulling thread through silk. This tension between official roles and personal feelings runs through palace life like an underground stream. Everyone is expected to subordinate individual wishes to collective harmony and hierarchical duty. Yet people remain people with their own dreams, frustrations, loves, disappointments. The structure provides stability and order, but at a cost some find harder to bear than others. If she does not regret her choice, or rather, the choice made for her by her family. Palace service has provided security, purpose, opportunities to develop skills and knowledge she would never have accessed otherwise. She has witnessed history unfolding, has seen kings come and go, has played her small part in the grand pageant of the dynasty. She thinks about her life, the path not taken when she entered palace service as a young girl, the family she might have had, the different experiences she might have accumulated. When she dies, she will be buried with honors, her service recognized, her name remembered by those who come after. The night deepens. In the king's quarters, attendants maintain their watch, ready to respond immediately if summoned. The king, in his private chambers, may still be awake, reading by lamplight, or perhaps in meditation, sitting quietly, letting his mind settle after the demands of the day. The practice of meditation, drawn from both Confucian and Buddhist traditions, involves sitting in stillness, allowing thoughts to arise and pass without attachment, gradually quieting the constant mental chatter that normally occupies consciousness. In this stillness, one might touch something deeper, a fundamental awareness existing beneath surface noise of ordinary thinking. Outside, in the city beyond palace walls, life continues in its own rhythms. Seoul, the capital, spreads around the palace in densely packed neighborhoods where commoners live, work, love, quarrel, celebrate, mourn. They know the palace exists, the great buildings visible from many points in the city, the high walls marking the boundary between royal space and common space. For a king, these moments of solitary quiet might be the only times when the weight of responsibility lifts slightly, when he is not performing a role, but simply being. Yet even here, complete escape is impossible. The knowledge of all that depends on his decisions, awareness of all those lives affected by his actions, these cannot be set aside entirely. Yet the kingdom's official ideology insists the king governs for their benefit, that his purpose is to ensure their welfare, to maintain peace and order so they can farm their fields, conduct their businesses, raise their families. Whether this ideal matches reality varies, depending on the particular king and the particular period. The Confucian political philosophy underlying the Joseon state includes the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers receive authority from heaven, from the fundamental ordering principle of the cosmos, but can lose that mandate if they govern badly. They know the king and his court live lives utterly different from their own, lives of luxury and power they can barely imagine. Some monarchs take their responsibilities to common people seriously, implementing reforms and relief measures. Others become isolated in palace luxury, losing touch with actual conditions beyond the walls. Natural disasters, rebellions, military defeats, these can all be interpreted as signs that heaven has withdrawn its support, that the ruler has failed in his duties. This creates a check on royal power, at least in theory. A king who becomes tyrannical risks not only political opposition, but cosmic disapproval. Scholar officials feel emboldened to criticize and remonstrate because they see themselves as serving heaven's mandate, helping the king govern properly, thus maintaining the kingdom's legitimacy. In this deep night, the palace feels ancient, haunted not by ghosts in any literal sense, but by accumulated weight of history. Centuries of human lives, of births and deaths, of celebrations and tragedies, of routine days and momentous events, all have unfolded within these walls. As midnight passes, the palace reaches its deepest quiet. Even guards, though still alert, move less frequently, allowing longer intervals between rounds. Oil lamps burn low, some guttering out, leaving pockets of absolute darkness between remaining lights. The buildings themselves have been rebuilt multiple times, destroyed by fires or wars and reconstructed, yet always following the same patterns, maintaining continuity with the past. War and invasion have devastated the palace more than once across the dynasty's long history. Each rebuilding afterward became an act of national restoration, reasserting Korean identity and royal authority after trauma. But in this moment, in a period of stability and strength, such disasters feel distant. The palace's relationship to the capital city mirrors the court's relationship to the kingdom as a whole. It is both separate and connected, elevated yet dependent, powerful yet vulnerable. The palace consumes resources brought from throughout the kingdom, food and crafts and materials of all kinds. Thousands of people labor to support the relatively small population living within the walls. In the quietest hours, palace residents who are awake might hear distant sounds from beyond the walls, a dog barking, a cart passing on a nearby street, voices raised in argument or laughter. These sounds, muffled by distance and walls, serve as reminders that the palace, for all its isolation and distinctiveness, exists within and as part of a larger society. Yet the palace also provides benefits to the surrounding area. It employs many people directly and creates markets for goods and services. Artists and craftspeople can make fine livings serving palace needs. This extraction of resources creates resentment at times, particularly during periods of hardship when commoners struggle to meet tax obligations while seeing wealth flow toward the capital and the court. The concentration of power and wealth attracts merchants, scholars, and ambitious people from throughout the kingdom, making the capital a vibrant, cosmopolitan place despite official Confucian disdain for commerce and commercial culture. He has witnessed much during his decades of service. He has seen young princes grow to manhood and ascend the throne, seen queens age from beauty to dignity, seen officials rise and fall, seen fashions and concerns change. Yet underneath, he perceives that fundamental patterns remain constant. Human nature does not change. In the quiet darkness, a lone figure moves through one of the palace gardens. It is an elderly court eunuch, one who has served since boyhood, now unable to sleep due to aches and pains that come with age. He walks slowly, enjoying the coolness of night air, the scent of flowers and earth, the sound of water and wind. His position as a eunuch places him in a liminal category, neither one thing nor another in traditional understanding, not eligible for highest positions, yet sometimes wielding considerable influence through proximity to power. Some eunuchs have become corrupt, using their positions to accumulate wealth and advantages. As he walks, he thinks about his childhood in a poor farming village, the decision his family made to have him castrated and placed in palace service, trading his wholeness for the possibility of security and advancement. At the time, as a young boy, he could not fully understand what was being done to him or why. The pain and trauma of the procedure left scars, both physical and emotional. Now, approaching the end of his life, he feels a kind of peace. He has served loyally. He has maintained his integrity as much as possible within a system that required compromises. He has formed friendships, learned much, seen the inner workings of power and governance. If he could return to that moment in his childhood and choose differently, would he? He does not know. The struggles for power, the negotiations of relationships, the balance between duty and desire, these eternal themes play out again and again in slightly different forms. Others serve with humble dedication, finding meaning in their role despite its compromises and losses. Yet he survived, adapted, found ways to create a life within the constraint imposed on him. Perhaps the question is meaningless. The past cannot be changed. One can only live forward from wherever one finds oneself. The palace, this small universe with its own laws and rhythms, prepares for another day. The officials will gather again in the courtyard. The king will preside over morning court. The cooks will prepare elaborate meals. The scholars will study and debate. The court ladies will practice their arts. The guards will maintain their watch. The eastern sky begins to show the faintest hint of paling, the first suggestion that night will end and day return. The cycle completes itself, and a new cycle begins. In the royal quarters, attendants who have rested during the night begin to stir, preparing to wake the king and begin the morning routines once again. The administrative machinery will process its endless stream of documents and decisions. Yet nothing remains static. Even as this single day unfolds, forces of change are at work, though their effects may not become visible for years or decades. New ideas filter into the kingdom from contacts with China and, through China, with a wider world. Each day is both unique and the same, individual moments accumulating into patterns, patterns extending into traditions, traditions creating culture, culture shaping civilization. The Joseon dynasty, at this moment in its history, represents a peak of Korean cultural achievement, a society that has refined its institutions and practices through centuries of development. The morning star shines brightly now in the paling sky, herald of the returning sun. In the palace, in the city beyond its walls, throughout the kingdom, people wake to begin their daily work. Farmers in distant provinces rise to tend their fields. Fishermen along the coasts prepare their boats. Merchants open their shops. Monks in mountain temples chant morning prayers. All are connected, threads in a vast social fabric woven from countless individual lives and actions. The king, at the center, serves as the symbolic and actual connection point, the axis around which everything else rotates. When the king acts virtuously and governs wisely, the theory goes, this virtue radiates outward, bringing order and prosperity throughout the kingdom. Economic changes, technological developments, shifts in population and agriculture, all these gradually transform the society in ways that no single person can fully perceive or control. Shamans make offerings at village shrines. Officials in provincial capitals begin their own morning routines, miniature versions of court rituals in the capital. This is heavy burden for any human being to carry. The king, despite all his privileges and luxuries, lives in a kind of captivity, his life not his own, every action scrutinized and judged, every decision carrying potential consequences for millions of people. The sun breaks over the eastern mountains, its first rays touching the highest roof ridges of the palace buildings. The tiles, glazed in green or gray, seem to glow with borrowed light. The illumination spreads downward, touching walls, courtyards, gardens. When the king fails in his duties, disorder spreads, and the entire society suffers. He cannot simply please himself, cannot follow his own desires if they conflict with his duties, cannot escape the expectations and demands that surround him from the moment he wakes until he sleeps, and even in dreams. As you complete this journey through a single day, having followed the sun from before dawn through the hours of light and darkness back to dawn again, perhaps you carry away something of value. The palace world, for all its strangeness to modern eyes, reflects fundamental human concerns. Another day has begun in this great palace, another cycle in the endless turning of the seasons, another page in the long story of the Joseon dynasty. Perhaps you have gained some understanding of how people in very different circumstances live their lives, pursued meaning, created beauty, struggled with problems both universal and specific to their time and place. These questions have no final answers, but human cultures across time and space have developed different approaches to addressing them. The Joseon dynasty created one such approach, a sophisticated system integrating political philosophy, ethical principles, aesthetic values, and practical governance into a coherent whole. How do we create order out of chaos? How do we pass wisdom and values from one generation to the next? How do we balance individual needs against collective requirements? How do we make room for beauty and creativity alongside practical necessities? How do we face the knowledge of our mortality and the transience of all things we build and cherish? As you drift now towards sleep, let the images and rhythms of this palace day wash over you like gentle waves on a distant shore. The sound of bronze bells marking the hours, their tones spreading through air like ripples through water. The rustle of silk robes and wooden corridors, a whisper that sounds like wind through leaves. The splash of water in garden ponds where carp swim in circles older than memory. The scratch of brushes on paper, making marks that transform ink into meaning. The voices of officials debating in formal language, their words precise as architecture. The songs of court musicians on stringed instruments, notes that bend and tremble like candlelight. That this system eventually gave way to new forms does not diminish its historical achievement or the ways it enriched the lives of those who participated in it. Let yourself rest in this distant time and place, where the problems of the present cannot reach you, where you can observe without obligation, witness without judgment, exist in the gentle flow of historical time that has already passed and cannot be changed. The crackling of kitchen fires and the bubbling of cauldrons, alchemy transforming ingredients into sustenance. The footsteps of guards on night patrol, steady and reassuring. The wind in willow trees, a sound like the breathing of the earth itself. The call of birds at daybreak, announcing the sun's return. The palace continues its rhythms across the centuries, preserved now in memory and history, in stories passed down, in buildings reconstructed, in artifacts held in museums and traditions maintained by those who value cultural continuity. There is peace in this distance, this perspective, this momentary escape from the urgency of your own era into a world that moved more slowly, where patience was a virtue and hurry a vice. Rest now in the peace of the palace, in the security of its walls that have stood against time and weather, in the beauty of its gardens where water and stone and living plants create harmony, in the wisdom of its scholars who spent lifetimes pursuing understanding, in the dedication of its servants who found meaning in their roles, however humble. Though the Joseon dynasty ended, though the palace has experienced destruction and restoration, though Korea itself has been transformed almost beyond recognition by the forces of modernity, still something persists, some essence of that earlier world, available to those who seek it with imagination and openness. In the endless cycle of dawn and day and dusk and night that continues whether humans mark it or not, the day is complete. The circle closes. The story has been told in whispers and in silence. And now, as the sun rises once more over the palace, step back through time to your own moment, carrying with you the gift of perspective, the treasure of understanding, the gentle calm of having touched for a brief span, a world where beauty and order merged, where humans strive to create harmony between earth and heaven, between past and present, between individual and society. Sleep now, and dream of palace gardens where willow branches trail in clear water, where poetry is written in elegant script that flows like water, finding its path downhill, where music floats on evening air like perfume from invisible flowers, where the great wheel of ritual and routine turns smoothly, eternally, carrying all along in its embrace, offering rest to the weary. Let the weight of your own concerns drift away like incense smoke rising toward a painted ceiling. Let your breathing slow to match the patient pace of court ceremonies where each movement is deliberate, each gesture meaningful. Let your thoughts become as calm as the surface of the lotus pond at midnight, reflecting stars without disturbing them, between what is and what might be. Sleep, and let the centuries cradle you in their vast arms. Sleep, and be held by history itself, by all those lives that came before and all that will come after, by the endless human attempt to create meaning and beauty in the brief time we are given. The palace gates stand open in your dreams. Walk through them now. The stone guardians nod as you pass. The courtyard spread before you, empty and peaceful. The buildings rise around you, their curved roofs sheltering you from a sky full of stars. You are home in a place you have never been. You are safe in a time that is not your own. Peace to the troubled, perspective to the lost. Sleep and dream of a palace where time moves differently, where every action has significance, where order and grace merge into something approaching the eternal. Rest now, dream now, let go now. The palace will keep watch while you sleep. The guards will walk their rounds. The cooks will tend their fires. The scholars will keep learning. The court ladies will practice their arts. The king will bear his burden. And you can simply rest, held by this world of order and beauty, drifting like a leaf on a quiet stream, moving toward a dawn that never fully arrives, suspended forever in this moment before the sun breaks free of the mountains, when everything is potential and nothing is yet determined, when all things are possible and peace flows like water, like silk, like time itself, like breath. You are at peace in this great palace where dawn comes slowly, where the sun takes its time climbing the mountains, where there is no rush, no urgency, only the gentle unfolding of one moment into the next. Like sleep, like the space between heartbeats where the world grows quiet and the mind grows still and the body finally lets go.